Chapter 3202. However, it was clear that waiting for a few decades was not the same for those ordinary living beings. Some of those ordinary living beings did not even have any cultivation base or extraordinary traits. What they had was something that Luo Fan had bestowed upon them, something that was extraordinarily compatible with those paths. Apart from that, everything about them was essentially no different from ordinary living beings. In that case, if they wanted to survive, they would need all sorts of things to replenish their energy, just like ordinary living beings. For example, eating, drinking, defecating, clothing, food, shelter, and transportation. It was clear that in order to maintain the needs of a large number of living beings, they would need to be organized. Moreover, it was clear that these living beings had their own organizations. In the world where they were born, there were countries, civilizations, and all sorts of forces. Under such circumstances, after they entered this world, they did not even need to change much. They could directly form complete organizations to develop this world. This world was like the world where they were born, and it could maintain the survival of most of their members. In that case, it was easy to imagine the changes that would happen to this world. Although it had only been a few decades, the entire world seemed to be filled with traces of countless civilizations. The entire world seemed to have completely turned into an ordinary world where intelligent living beings were born. The barren world that was created by the endless heaven and earth tribulations to accommodate all those who had transcended had long disappeared without a trace. If new cultivators stepped into this world now, even if they knew how they had entered this world, they would probably doubt their own senses. After all, no matter how one looked at this world, it seemed like an ordinary world. It was not much different from the world that they had left. As for a civilization with countless members, it was impossible for there to be no changes in the members of a civilization that had existed for decades. For any civilization with potential, it was almost inevitable for the number of members to increase. After all, there were too many activities in a civilization that could increase the number of members. Therefore, after several decades, this civilization had a large number of members who were born and raised in this world. Compared to their fathers and grandfathers, these members had a special characteristic. They had fused with those paths to begin with. No matter how ordinary this world seemed, it was not ordinary at all. After all, it was a world that had been created by the endless heaven and earth tribulations to test all those who had transcended. In such a world, any living being only needed a thought to obtain the basic qualifications to set foot on a certain path. This was the case even if the qualifications were countless times higher than the original cultivation realm of that living being. In this way, the living beings that were born and raised in this world could not be like the living beings that were born in ordinary world. In an ordinary world, if a living being wanted to obtain power, even if it was in a world that was most compatible with supernatural powers, they would have to go through many dangers, surmount many difficulties, and go through many trials to achieve it. However, in this world, if they wanted to achieve this, they only needed a thought to obtain it. The great difference was self-evident. With such a difference, there would naturally be a huge difference in the way living beings grew. After the living beings that were born and raised in this world gained complete consciousness, they naturally knew how to suppress their desires and listen to their seniors' instructions, not stepping onto those paths. However, what about when they did not have complete consciousness? Clearly, when they did not have complete consciousness, they could not have such self-control. Therefore, it was naturally impossible for any living being born in this world to behave like their parents and ancestors and treat those paths as if they didn't exist. By the time they gained complete consciousness and knew how to suppress their impulses and desires, they would have already completed the entire process of coming into contact with those paths. However, this did not mean that the living beings that were born and raised in this world did not have the chance to grow. Those that had complete consciousness had the advantage of having complete consciousness. Those that did not have complete consciousness also had the advantage of not having complete consciousness. Those that had complete consciousness knew self-control and knew how to weigh the pros and cons. They would not easily choose to accept the test and step onto those paths. Those that did not have complete consciousness did not know self-control, did not know how to weigh the pros and cons, and did not know how to suppress their desires and impulses. Thus, they would choose to step onto those paths when things were messy. However, it was precisely because they did not have complete consciousness that they could not truly step onto those paths. Those paths were meant to test the ability of those who had transcended in this world to walk on those paths. Under such circumstances, only those who had the qualifications to move forward on those paths could truly accept the test and step onto those paths. If they did not even have complete consciousness and the ability to walk on those paths, how could they truly step onto those paths? Clearly, the living beings that were born and raised in this world would have a period of time where they had the initiative to choose but did not have the qualifications to step onto those paths. This, of course, formed a rather awkward situation for the test. That was, they had already obtained the benefits, but in the end, they did not have the qualifications to accept the test. It was as if they were already standing on the doorstep and taking a step out, but could not step into the door. They could only have 1 foot outside and 1 foot inside. Thus, this change resulted in the living beings that were born and raised in this world being fundamentally different from the living beings that were born and raised in other worlds. To a certain extent, they could already be counted as existences that were compatible with those paths. Essentially, each such living being could actually be counted as the embodiment of the beginning of a certain path. They had many characteristics that belonged to those paths, and this, combined with the special characteristics that Luo Fan had bestowed upon them, made them extremely compatible with those paths. As a result, although they did not accept the endless trials of the world's tribulations, they were actually exploring those trials in a different manner. In other words, they could be said to be constantly simulating the process of accepting the trials. Along with this change, the living beings that were born and raised in this world were as strong as the sky and the earth when compared to their fathers and ancestors. This huge difference caused the potential of this civilization to continuously rise with the passage of time. It could be predicted that in another few decades, they would be able to truly match up to the transcendent. After another few decades, the number of living beings that were born and raised in this world would probably reach an unimaginable level. And with the special characteristics of these living beings, they could already be considered stronger than the majority of the transcendent. Although they were weaker than the truly powerful transcendents, just the fact that they were stronger than the majority of the transcendents was already enough for them to match up to the other transcendent. At this time, the transcendents had clearly already discovered this famous peculiarity. He discovered the mysteries of the native-born creatures that had just been born in this civilization. How could we have overlooked them before? At this time, the transcendents all had similar doubts in their hearts. This was also because the transcendents themselves were quite extraordinary, which was why they could discover this. Because of their extraordinary nature, although they couldn't sense the changes in the past, they could still vaguely sense some kind of peculiar feeling from another timeline. Thus, they discovered this abnormality that should have been incomparably natural to them and shouldn't have been felt at all. However, it was clear that even the sixth tribulation experts couldn't clearly recognize that all of this was due to the changes in the past. Compared to the other transcendents, the sixth tribulation experts only felt that the abnormality was more intense. But as for the specifics, they didn't know at all. It was precisely because of this that such a situation had occurred. They have the special characteristics of those paths. In that case, we can consciously guide them. The transcendents already had their own conclusions. The living beings that were born and raised in this world naturally wouldn't choose a fixed path during the process of their unconscious growth. In the process of their growth, they would naturally choose a random path. In this case, this situation was clearly not enough to satisfy those who had transcended all over the world. After all, the transcendents had already opened up a certain path and confirmed that it was the correct path. Moreover, they had already sacrificed a lot for that path. Under such circumstances, they naturally couldn't completely change their way of thinking just because the living beings that were born and raised here had all sorts of conveniences. They wouldn't completely sever all of their previous sacrifices. Thus, completely copying their specialties and only accepting their specialties was clearly out of the question. Of course, this didn't mean that they couldn't think of anything else. Even in the mortal world, there was such a thing as prenatal education, let alone the transcendence. Compared to the prenatal education of the mortal world, the transcendence could do many more things, and the effects were more spectacular. Thus, before the living beings that were born and raised here truly matured and decided on a path, they could use certain methods to influence them and make them choose the path they wanted them to choose. This wasn't a difficult matter for the transcendent. And once they chose the correct path for the transcendence, it would obviously be a good thing for both the transcendents and the living beings that were born and raised here. For the transcendents, there was no need to say much. Every living being that was born and raised here was a type of simulation of that path. This would give them a chance to walk the path before they actually chose it. This was equivalent to taking out the test paper early and letting the examinees try it a few times, a few hundred times, a few thousand times, tens of thousands of times. It went without saying how great the benefits were for them. The situation was similar for the living beings that were born and raised here. After all, for the living beings that were born and raised here, choosing a path was equivalent to deciding their entire lives, deciding their own future. Under such circumstances, choosing the correct path that the transcendents had explored and opened up after sacrificing time and time again was obviously more perfect than choosing other paths with unknown futures. After all, there was a certain chance of success if one chose this path, but the future of the other paths was completely uncertain. Under such circumstances, the benefits of accepting the influence of the transcendents naturally didn't need to be mentioned. Along with this change, the attempts on the path that had been going on like a raging fire had come to a halt. Even the transcendents who had already set foot on the path and started sprinting on it stopped moving at this time. They began to divert some of their attention to participate in the prenatal education for the living beings that were born and raised here. After all, no matter how fast they were, with the abilities of those who had transcended, even if they chose the correct path and truly walked that path, or if they were truly stuck at a certain point on that path, the amount of time needed would still be calculated in the tens of thousands of years, or even hundreds of thousands of years. In such a long time, diverting a few decades or even a few centuries to deal with other matters was like blinking an eye while running. Clearly, such a situation didn't put any pressure on the transcendents at all. That was why they could divert some of their attention to participate in the prenatal education at this time. Not to mention the fact that diverting some of their attention wouldn't affect them much. Even if it did affect them greatly, they would still do it without hesitation. After all, compared to the benefits they would obtain, the risks they would take were nothing. It was precisely because of these considerations that the atmosphere of the entire world changed so obviously. The focus of the transcendents shifted from the path to the living beings that were born and raised here. Chapter 3203. Time slowly passed as the transcendent beings focused their attention on the native living beings. Before they knew it, tens of thousands of years had passed. In the past few decades, this world had undergone such obvious changes. Now that tens of thousands of years had passed, the changes in this world were many times greater than in the first few decades. Now, the number of ordinary living beings that had been absorbed into this world had increased by tens of thousands of times. Back then, the number of ordinary living beings that had been absorbed into this world had been calculated in the trillions. Now that the number had increased by tens of thousands of times, the number had to be calculated in the trillions. Among so many living beings, the living beings that had truly come from the world that had been changed by Luo Fan were only a few 10,000th of the total number. Even if the living beings that had stepped into this world had not suffered any losses for tens of thousands of years and were still alive, their proportion was still only a few 10,000th of the current population of this civilization. It was clear that most of the living beings that had stepped into this world were only ordinary living beings. Even if they were extremely compatible with their paths because of Luo Fan's changes, the difference in essence still made them unable to compete with those who had taken the paths from the 5 to the 6 tribulations. Therefore, even if they had chosen their path according to the requirements of the endless tribulations and obtained the foundation to take the path from the 5 to the 6 tribulations, they would not be able to walk too far on that path in the end. As such, after tens of thousands of years, only an extremely small portion of them were still alive. Moreover, most of them had already obtained immortality before they had stepped into this world. The remaining small portion also relied on the uniqueness of this world to obtain immortality in this world. Compared to the living beings that had come from outside this world, the living beings that had grown up in this world were clearly different. Now, even most of the native living beings that had been born in this world were still alive. As for those that had been born later on, there was no need to even mention them. It could be said that the current absolute leaders of the entire civilization were the living beings that were born and raised in this world. The reason for this was very simple. This was because these native creatures were innately compatible with a certain path. With the guidance of those who had transcended the world, most of them were able to walk the correct path that had already been taken. Under such circumstances, as soon as they were born with complete intelligence, they naturally grasped great power. Even the essence of life had unknowingly risen to an unimaginable height. And this height was obviously enough for him to live forever. Under such circumstances, it was almost impossible for them to die of old age. Of course, the reason why only a majority of them managed to survive and a small portion of them disappeared in the passage of time was naturally because the native creatures were not isolated from the world. It was not that he was isolated from the world, so he naturally had all sorts of grudges with others. With gratitude and hatred, there would naturally be battles. If there was a fight, there would naturally be casualties. Therefore, even if almost all of them had obtained longevity after being born, there was still a portion that could not live until tens of thousands of years later. After tens of thousands of years of development, the survival rate of those who had transcended had increased by many times. Almost all of the transcendent experts were still alive. In fact, he had already walked to the extreme depths of the correct path that he had chosen for himself. That's right, after tens of thousands of years, even those who had transcended had no choice but to choose a path and accept the endless trials of the world's tribulations. Even those who had transcended the world's tribulations were no exception. After all, as mentioned before, a few years or even a few decades were nothing compared to the endless tribulations. Therefore, they could afford to delay. However, if it was too long, the endless tribulations would not be able to accept it. Tens of thousands of years was clearly not a short period of time compared to the endless tribulations. Therefore, during this period of time, they naturally had to choose a path and accept the true trials of the tribulations. However, although the sixth tribulation experts had accepted the trials of the tribulations and chosen a path, in reality, after tens of thousands of years, there were no longer any sixth tribulation experts in this world. As for the reason? Of course, it was because the sixth tribulation experts had already completed the trials and escaped. After all, the path between the fifth and sixth tribulations was too simple and relaxing for sixth tribulation experts. Even if they slowed down, it would only take them a few days to pass through. Not to mention, after they set foot on the path, they didn't need to slow down at all. They could walk at their own pace. In this way, their speed would naturally be faster. Perhaps they would be able to complete the entire process in just a few minutes. In this way, No matter how long they delayed the trials, they would have already completed the trials after tens of thousands of years and disappeared from this world. The disappearance of these sixth tribulation experts from this world was clearly a huge blow to the other transcendent. The path that would take them hundreds of thousands of years or even millions of years to complete would only take a few minutes for others. Moreover, they would be trembling with fear with every step they took, worried that a single wrong step would cause all their previous efforts to go to waste. However, for others they could completely walk with their eyes open. They did not need to care about any obstacles or traps along the way at all. The complexity of this feeling was self-evident. The more they saw how relaxed the sixth tribulation experts were, the clearer they understood just how powerful the sixth tribulation experts were. For a moment, they looked forward to the rewards they would reap after completing the path. Although tens of thousands of years had passed, the fourth tribulation expert who had chosen the path in front of everyone was still in this world. And the depth he had walked on that path was also the deepest among all the transcendents in the world. On the other hand, his research on the native creatures was the most thorough among all the transcendent transcendents. After all, the path that the native lifeforms were compatible with was already a path that he had opened. Thus, among all the transcendents in this world, the one who was most familiar with this path was naturally him. And because he was familiar with the path, he was naturally extremely familiar with these lifeforms. With this sense of familiarity, he could naturally see through many things that the other transcendents would need to carefully study, make bold assumptions, and carefully verify with a single glance. It could even be generalized and directly see the deeper mysteries within it. In this way, he would naturally be able to easily see the profundities of the paths that the native creatures possessed. Naturally, it would be easier for him to obtain the mysteries he wanted, the process he wanted to understand, and thus obtain the most benefit. It was precisely because of this that he had been able to greatly advance his progress on that path. According to his current progress, he had originally estimated that it would take him at least tens of thousands of years to reach this level. But now, in just a short tens of thousands of years, he had already completed this process. At this moment, what Luo Fan, who was in the midst of splitting his Tao fruits, was not what was happening in this world. What his eyes saw was the past, the present, and the future. Among them, his focus was on the future that he did not have much control over, or rather, the possibilities of the future. The possibilities of the future were endless, especially when it came to tribulations. After all, tribulations were supreme existences that originated from the state of chaos. Even for him, the strength of this endless world tribulation was nothing. If he wanted to, he could even directly extinguish it. However, this did not change the subtlety of the endless world tribulation's essence. No matter how weak it was, it originated from the path of a Tao master, and even from the state of chaos. The essence of such an existence clearly far surpassed the scope of the endless world. And this transcendence made it obvious that Luo Fan could not use the mysterious power of splitting Tao fruits that could only cover the endless world to control the endless world tribulation. For things that had already been determined in the past, he could indeed use various methods to change them. However, for the future that was still in a state of possibility, it was clearly not something he could change too much. At this moment, no matter how many future possibilities Luo Fan occupied, he would find that the endless world tribulation would give rise to even more possibilities. Moreover, this kind of derivation was even more, and it wasn't just an ordinary amount, but an unimaginable amount. It had almost reached a terrifying level where if he occupied one of them, it would give rise to thousands of possibilities. Under such circumstances, it could be said that no matter how many future possibilities he occupied, he would only find that the future was shrouded in fog, and it was difficult for him to truly control it. He even vaguely had an inexplicable feeling that if he got too involved, the tribulations might eventually pull him into the tribulations as well or, from a certain point of view, The current state where the future possibilities skyrocketed could be regarded as a kind of tribulations for him. However, although he knew this, Luo Fan did not stop occupying the future possibilities. Whether it was in terms of controlling the future or in terms of controlling Tao fruits, he could not stop this process. Naturally, there was no need to say much about controlling the future. Each of these possibilities represented a possibility in the future. The existence of each possibility represented a possible situation in the future. If he did not occupy the future because there were too many possibilities, it would be like knowing that he would definitely die, so he was too lazy to live. The aspect of controlling the Tao fruits was actually very obvious. This method of controlling the past and occupying the future was derived from the Tao fruit. Under such circumstances, mastering this ability would naturally be closer to the essence of the Tao fruits to a certain extent. Getting closer to the essence would naturally make it easier to control and split the Tao fruits. At this moment, as Luo Fan occupied more and more of the future, although the future possibilities also skyrocketed, compared to the beginning, the proportion of the future possibilities he occupied had actually decreased. However, because the future possibilities he occupied were no longer on the same scale as before, he could already feel that his affinity with the Tao fruits had greatly increased at this moment. Although the Tao fruits were constructed by Luo Fan, and everything within them could be regarded as his will. However, in reality, the Tao fruits were still just external objects. Luo Fan could not be more clear about this. If it was not an external object, the island would have completely fused with him by now. How could things be like this? It was clearly his Tao fruits, but he could only obtain the power of the Tao fruits when he was within it. He had probably already fully grasped this power a long time ago. Once he completely grasped this power, occupying the future and changing the past would definitely not be as troublesome as it was now. Perhaps with just a thought, he would be able to grasp millions of future possibilities. In fact, the depth of his control over the past, present, and future might not be as deep as it was right now. It would only be limited to the current span. That span would definitely be hundreds or even thousands of times greater than it was now. Of course, he had to first get rid of the eighth Great Tribulation before anything else. After all, the eighth Great Tribulation had already limited the amount of time he could control. It was not something that could be affected by whether or not he had the Tao fruits or not. At this time, Luo Fan did not think too much. At this time, he was just trying his best to occupy the possibility of the future, trying his best to strengthen his own influence on the possibility of the future. As he strengthened his influence, he could vaguely sense that the Tao fruits seemed to be undergoing some sort of subtle change. It was as if they were constantly absorbing some sort of nourishment along with the changes. Under the nourishment, they seemed to be undergoing some sort of indescribable growth. Luo Fan was naturally happy to see these changes. Chapter 3204. To all life in the endless heavens and earth, it was a disaster. To the endless heavens and earth itself, it was an extremely difficult test. However, to the fruit of Tao and Luo Fan's clone, the endless heavenly tribulation was an excellent opportunity for it to grow. What did the fruit of Tao rely on to grow? Based on Luo Fan's understanding of the fruit of Tao, one of the most important ways for the fruit of Tao to grow was through unearthing the possibilities of the future. The possibilities of the future were limitless. Anyone with a slight understanding of the mysterious existence known as time would know this. However, although the future was limitless, it did not mean that the possibilities of the future that an object could come into contact with were truly limitless. This was the case even if the object was the fruit of Tao. For any object, a large portion of the limitless possibilities of the future included the possibility that the object would perish. Evidently, for the possibility that the object would perish, the fruit of Tao would not be able to come into contact with it. After all, these possibilities represented the object's own disappearance. Since the object was about to perish, then it was naturally impossible for it to come into contact with that possibility. This alone was enough to confirm that even if the possibilities of the future were limitless, there would definitely be various reasons that prevented the object from truly coming into contact with those countless possibilities. Of course, in comparison, most of the possibilities were naturally not as extreme as the possibility that the object would perish within those possibilities. However, although it was not that extreme, the essence was still the essence, and it could not be changed no matter what. For ordinary objects, being unable to come into contact with all the possibilities of the future did not have much of an impact. After all, for ordinary objects, no matter how many possibilities there were in the future, what they truly possessed was only one type of future, or rather, only one type of future possibility. Even if this type of possibility had countless possibilities before it truly became a reality, and could materialize in any form, it would still materialize in the end. In the end, it would become the only type of future that could be determined. Therefore, for such objects, whether or not they could come into contact with more possibilities in the future did not have much of an impact. However, it was clear that the situation was completely different for the fruit of Tao. For the fruit of Tao, grasping the past, present, and future was one of its most fundamental characteristics. In the past, to the Tao fruit, it was able to control more and more of the past upstream. In the lower reaches, it was able to control more and more possibilities of the future, and it was able to control more and more of the future downstream. This was how the Tao fruit grew. Under such circumstances, it was impossible to truly come into contact with the limitless possibilities of the future. For the Tao fruit, this clearly meant that its growth method would never be perfect no matter what. After all, no matter how much one grasped the possibilities of the future, it was impossible to truly grasp the infinite possibilities. Under such circumstances, it was obvious what effect the boundless tribulation would have on the Tao fruit's growth. The possibilities of the future that this Tao fruit could naturally come into contact with were limited. Coupled with the fact that the Tao fruit's current growth rate was also a type of limitation, the possibilities it could come into contact with in the future were much smaller than the possibilities it could naturally come into contact with. Due to the existence of the endless heavenly tribulations, no matter how many future possibilities the Tao fruit occupied, there would be even more future possibilities that appeared within the range of the Tao fruit's senses, or rather, within the range of the Tao fruit's touch. This was equivalent to pulling a large number of future possibilities that the Tao fruit could not naturally come into contact with in front of it, and directly connecting it with those future possibilities. Even if the fundamental goal was to prevent the Tao fruit from occupying all the future possibilities of the heavenly tribulations, and to obstruct the Tao fruit from grasping the future, but in reality, for the Tao fruit, this kind of change was equivalent to helping it expand the range of future possibilities it could come into contact with in the future. This was naturally a great thing for the fruit of Tao's growth. Right now, the changes that were happening to the Tao fruit were the manifestation of this benefit. In the beginning, Luo Fan naturally couldn't see this clearly. But as time passed, as the Tao fruit continued to grow and improve amidst these changes, how could he not notice this? For a moment, he had a good impression of the endless heavenly tribulations. The heavenly tribulations are growth. In this case, this heavenly tribulations are also my opportunity. Luo Fan could not help but sigh ruefully when he sensed the heavenly tribulations' great help to the Tao fruit's growth. From a certain point of view, Luo Fan had actually already thrown himself into the heavenly tribulations. Although the method he used to throw himself into the heavenly tribulations was different from the method used by those who had transcended, and the heavenly tribulations themselves, it was more mysterious and inconceivable. But it was still a form of throwing himself into the heavenly tribulations. Now that he understood the benefits of continuously expanding the future possibilities to the Tao fruit, Luo Fan naturally would not hold back. At this time, he began to use the Tao fruit to occupy even more future possibilities at a faster rate and expand his existence into even more future possibilities as much as possible. Even if this method seemed futile, just the fact that it could bring benefits to the splitting of the fruits of ways, and just the fact that it could make his relationship with the splitting of the fruits of ways closer, was enough for him to put in effort in this direction. To Luo Fan, who was within the Tao fruit, the flow of time was actually meaningless. After all, to him, the past, the present, and the future were all within his control. Although the future only involved some possibilities, in terms of depth, it was not much different from true control. It was also control. Moreover, compared to the past, the degree of control was not much weaker as such, although it was only an instant. In reality, the past, present, and future, a total of 100 million years, were all displayed in Luo Fan's eyes like a still image. However, due to the heavenly tribulations, this still image was extremely active from another perspective. It was the breadth, in other words, the number of future possibilities. At this moment, time was like a still image in terms of length, but in terms of breadth, it was rapidly expanding, like a balloon being rapidly inflated. Faced with this situation, a strange expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. There was an indescribable joy on his face. Such a special feeling was also an extremely novel experience for him. In this experience, he felt that the essence of his life was already fundamentally different from ordinary living beings, and even ordinary cultivators. Time became unprecedentedly clear in his eyes. The past, present, and future, these three were gradually shrouded in fog before his eyes. In the past, even though he already had the ability to travel back and forth between the past, present, and future, he could clearly only be at a single point in time at the same time. In other words, he was either in the past, the present, or the future. Unless he split into clones, it was impossible for him to appear in the past, present, and future at the same time. However, the current situation was completely different. Currently, he could be said to be in the past, present, and future at the same time. He had already grown from being limited to a certain period of time to an entire timeline. From the birth of the endless heaven and earth to the present, it was a timeline that spanned 100 million years in the future. In this timeline, every one of him that existed in it was now a part of him. In other words, only when all of him were added together would he be considered to be complete. Such a life essence was clearly already fundamentally different from before. For Luo Fan, he did not really notice this difference at first. He still looked at the endless heaven and earth from the perspective of the past, and he looked at everything in the endless heaven and earth. However, this was only because he had just come into contact with this state, and he had yet to truly understand and grasp this state. As time passed, as he became more and more familiar with this state, and as his understanding of this state deepened, he naturally began to gradually notice the essence of this state and the changes in his life essence. Just like now, he could already use this perspective that belonged to this state to look at the endless heaven and earth, as well as everything in the endless heaven and earth tribulation. In fact, at this moment, in his eyes, the endless heaven and earth tribulation could already be said to be in a state that was between over and not over. In fact, in his eyes, the endless heaven and earth tribulation could already be said to be in a state that was between over and not over. It was said to be over because among the countless possibilities in the future that he had come into contact with, almost all of them would end after close to 100 million years. Although the endings of the endless heaven and earth tribulation were all different for him. Some were incomparably tragic, some were incomparably glorious, and some were somewhere between tragic and glorious. There were all sorts of endings, and they were practically unimaginable. It was said to be not over, because there were still countless future possibilities that were constantly being born at every moment. Among the possibilities that were being born, Luo Fan had yet to occupy them, so to those possibilities, he only belonged to the past and the present. The future still did not belong to him. Or rather, the future still had yet to arrive for these new possibilities. The endless heaven and earth tribulation clearly still existed, was still developing, and was still wreaking havoc in the endless heaven and earth. Therefore, for these possibilities, the endless heaven and earth tribulation still had yet to end. Looking at it from this perspective, it was clear that the endless heaven and earth tribulation would never end for him. After all, under the influence of the endless heaven and earth tribulation, the possibilities in the future were endless. No matter how much he occupied, there would always be more that would be born. Therefore, for him, the endless heaven and earth tribulation would always exist, and it would never pass. That is, unless, at some point, he would no longer care about the newly born future possibilities and simply let the future be bound to the present, allowing his present to naturally move downstream in time until the calamity truly passed. Only then would the endless heaven and earth tribulation truly pass for him. However, if he really did that, then the benefits that the endless heaven and earth tribulation could bring him would be wasted. This was clearly not something that Luo Fan would do. At the very least, he would not do it before he reached his cultivation goal. If this Dao fruit was a true primordial Dao fruit, then for Luo Fan, his cultivation goal was to completely integrate with this primordial Dao fruit and truly obtain the various characteristics of the primordial Dao fruit. In the end, he would become a primordial Dao fruit, and the primordial Dao fruit would be him. After reaching this step, he would naturally become a true saint. Just from this goal alone, one could imagine how difficult it would be to achieve this goal. It could be said that it was an almost limitless goal. This meant that he might need to exist in this state for an infinite amount of time. Of course, this was only his own perception of time. After all, in terms of real time, he was only in this instant. As for how to resolve the contradiction between the infinite time that he felt himself and the real time, there was no need to say more. Among the infinite possibilities, each possibility represented a long timeline. Experiencing infinite possibilities was equivalent to experiencing infinite timelines, which naturally meant that he had obtained an infinite amount of time. This obviously easily resolved the difference between the infinite time that he felt himself and the real time that he only experienced in an instant. In this way, success and failure would only be a matter of an instant for Luo Fan. To those watching from the outside, at this moment, Luo Fan had only obtained the primordial chaos Dao fruit. In the next moment, he would either be completely annihilated, completely fuse with the primordial chaos Dao fruit, or become a primordial chaos Dao fruit himself. Apart from this, there were no other possibilities. Unfortunately, what Luo Fan obtained at this time was not a primordial Dao fruit. Instead, it was just a product of the primordial Dao fruit's deterioration, a primordial Dao fruit that was limited to the endless world. Although such an existence had an extremely high intrinsic quality and possessed some of the mysteries of a Dao fruit, there was clearly a world of difference between it and a primordial Dao fruit. This kind of Dao fruit was clearly not enough for Luo Fan to spend endless time on it. Chapter 3205. The biggest limitation of the split Dao fruit was that it could only be used in a very low range. Apart from that, the other characteristics it possessed were all quite mysterious. Although it was still far inferior to the primordial Dao fruit's profundity, it was clearly attractive to Luo Fan. In order to obtain such a characteristic, Luo Fan was willing to spend a lot of time on it. However, it was a pity that the limitation of such a range made this Dao fruit, which was originally quite attractive to Luo Fan, become an existence of little value. After all, the endless world was vast and boundless. Just the number of transcendents in this world could be counted in the trillions. Now, there were even trillions of sixth tribulation experts. As for the number of worlds it contained, it had reached a shocking level. However, from the outside, it was just an island in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. Not to mention the Tao Master's path, even the sixth level of the Tao Master's path was insignificant. For such an existence, even if Luo Fan spent an endless amount of time to completely master and integrate with it, what could he do? Was it just to close the door and be a transcendent existence in this endless world? According to this principle, in reality, no matter what kind of Tao fruit it was, as long as it wasn't a chaotic Tao fruit that could truly function in the state of chaos, it was essentially no different from a split Tao fruit. It could be considered useless. Even if some Tao fruits could be used in the big world, or even in a certain level of the state of chaos, in essence they were still limited to the split Tao fruit. They were all limited to a certain range. Clearly, compared to the boundless world where the fruits of Wei were limited, the area where the fruits of Wei were limited would be many, many times larger. However, from the perspective of the primal chaos, it was still an insignificant speck. Even if this dot was countless times larger than the dot represented by the endless world, it was still a dot in this way. Its essence naturally did not change much. Naturally, Luo Fan's attractiveness did not increase much. From this point of view, Luo Fan no longer had any need to pursue any other Tao fruits besides the primordial chaos Tao fruit after obtaining the split Tao fruit. After all, any other Tao fruit was essentially the same as this Tao fruit of division. What he could obtain from other Tao fruits, he could also obtain from this split Tao fruit. What he couldn't obtain from splitting the Tao fruit, he couldn't obtain from other Tao fruits either. Of course, this didn't mean that condensing this Tao fruit was meaningless to him. The truth was the exact opposite. Now that he had condensed this Tao fruit, it was of great significance to Luo Fan, because, through this Tao fruit, he could already truly feel some of the characteristics of a true saint. That's right now, the characteristics that Luo Fan had obtained from splitting the Tao fruit were actually some of the characteristics of a true saint. Even if it was an extremely simple, extremely basic, or even shallow trait. This kind of opportunity was extremely rare for any existence below the true saint realm. Normally, existences below the true saint realm would be completely unable to understand anything related to a true saint. Even if it was a shadow, aura, or trace of a true saint, to existences below the true saint realm, it was too deep to be analyzed, imagined, described, or even sensed. However, now, through this Tao fruit, he could personally feel some of the characteristics that a true saint possessed. Even if this characteristic was extremely shallow, extremely simple, extremely ordinary, and extremely basic, it was still a characteristic of a true saint, and it was also an unprecedented great opportunity. This was like an ordinary person who originally had no chance to clearly see the fine structure of a substance suddenly obtaining a microscope. Through the microscope, he could barely see the fine structure of a substance that wasn't too precise. It was very obvious that this kind of seeing was still very shallow for the fine structure of a substance. It was a very poor kind of seeing. However, to an ordinary person, this was already a great increase in their perspective and understanding of the world. At least, through this method, he could know what the world was like on a general level. He could know that on a microscopic level, a substance had a completely different appearance. Obviously, to Luo Fan, the current situation was similar. After obtaining this Tao fruit, he was like an ordinary person who had obtained a microscope. Although the microscopic world that he saw through this microscope was still extremely far from the truth of the world, it was still much closer to the truth than before. In other words, through this Tao fruit, he could feel the characteristics of a true saint. Although it was still extremely far away from a real true saint, it was still much closer to the characteristics of a true saint than before. It went without saying how significant this was to Luo Fan. After all, Luo Fan had always been pursuing becoming a true saint. However, he could only rely on his guesses and deductions as to what kind of existence a true saint was and what kind of characteristics a true saint had. What kind of state would it be after becoming a true saint? What kind of feeling would that state have? What could he do and what could he accomplish in that state? All of these were all secrets to him. Under such circumstances, his pursuit of becoming a true saint was like his pursuit of stepping into a dense fog. Although that feeling was not to the extent of making him feel lost, it obviously had a certain impact on his clear goal. However, now that he had obtained this Tao fruit, it was equivalent to lifting a small part of that dense fog. This caused the fog that he was originally unable to see clearly to become a little thinner. At least, he could gradually see the general outline of the goal that he was pursuing that was shrouded in fog. Although it was still extremely blurry and he still could not see the true details, at least it was many times better than before when he could not see clearly. Because of this, although the Tao fruit before him did not require Luo Fan to spend endless time and energy to completely fuse with it and become this Tao fruit, he would not let it go. He would definitely spend a lot of effort to understand the various characteristics of this Tao fruit and sense the various mysteries of this Tao fruit. Not to mention the fact that he now had the division Tao fruit. To a certain extent, he could already slightly bypass the time limit of the eighth tribulation. For Luo Fan, he was less than 100 million years away from the arrival of the eighth trial. In other words, no matter what speed of time any of his incarnations were in, as long as the time limit was reached, his eighth trial would directly descend and completely pull him into it. At that time, everything he had and everything he had done in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path would be completely cut off. This limit was originally absolute. It was a limit that all incarnations were treated equally. However, now this incarnation of Luo Fan, who was already in the Tao fruit, could bypass this limit in another way. The limit of the eighth trial was the time that any incarnation could spend. However, the limitation was the length of time, not the breadth of time. Otherwise, with so many incarnations of Luo Fan, if the time that all of them had passed was added up, the total time would have already exceeded 100 million years. If that was the case, his eighth trial would have already descended. And now, he could clearly feel that the eighth trial had still not been brought forward. He still had to wait for nearly 100 million years. This meant that the time was not calculated by the sum of the time that all the incarnations had spent. And now, the situation of Luo Fan's avatar was similar to the countless avatars he had created. Because by relying on the Tao fruit of division, he had already transcended the past, present, and future. Thus, to him, although time was still in the present, his heart had actually already experienced countless times of close to 100 million years in the future. Every possibility in the future was close to 100 million years of time. In this way, for every additional future he occupied, it meant that he had experienced an additional 100 million years of time. This situation was clearly in conflict with the absolute time limit that the eighth trial had on him. However, if he thought about it from another perspective, this contradiction might be explained clearly. After all, different future possibilities were in themselves parallel. Although it was the same incarnation of Luo Fan who had experienced these possibilities, parallel was parallel. It was obviously different from continuous experience. In contrast, the situation was more like different incarnations that had experienced many future possibilities at the same time. In other words, it was not only this incarnation of Luo Fan who had experienced close to 100 million years of time, but his countless incarnations. Changing the originally continuous experience into parallel experiences was the greatest significance of the Tao fruit for Luo Fan now. In other words, it was the greatest significance of any Tao fruit for Luo Fan now. After all, the current limit for Luo Fan on the sixth level of the Tao Master's road was time. Because he only had close to 100 million years of time, he could not carry out many plans in cultivation. Many plans needed to be adjusted to accommodate time. Otherwise, how could the flow of time in the endless heaven and earth be so fast? Now, it seemed that there were countless benefits to the rapid flow of time in the endless heaven and earth, causing the development speed of the endless heaven and earth to reach an astonishing level. But that was only the result. It did not mean that he was destined to obtain this advantage from the beginning. It could be considered a lucky hit. In fact, in the beginning, Luo Fan's consideration for speeding up the flow of time in the endless heaven and earth to such an extent was because he did not have much time. Because he did not have much time, he had no choice but to speed up the flow of time in the endless heaven and earth to such an extent. As for the disadvantages of this acceleration, it was actually obvious at a glance. The greatest disadvantage was that Luo Fan could not truly immerse himself in it. Now, for the endless heaven and earth, it was unknown how many trillions of years had passed. However, for Luo Fan, how long had it been since the endless heaven and earth was born? The difference in time was so great that even though he was the creator of the endless heaven and earth, he still felt that there was a layer between him and the endless heaven and earth. It could even be said that his authority over the endless heaven and earth was squeezed to almost nothing by the overall consciousness of the transcendent. The fundamental reason was that he had not immersed himself in the endless heaven and earth at all. Because he had been watching from the side, there was a layer between him and the endless heaven and earth. Because the difference in the flow of time was too great, when the overall consciousness of the transcendent took action to squeeze his authority, he could not respond in time. Therefore, in the end, he had almost no authority over the endless heaven and earth. In the end, he had to rely on Xianqi, who had split the Tao fruit to regain it. It could be said that although the final result was not bad, in fact, all of this was only a choice made under helplessness. If he had enough time, the endless heaven and earth might not have developed to this stage. Perhaps it was just the beginning, but at least Luo Fan's relationship with the endless heaven and earth would not be so weak. Perhaps he would not gain as much as he did now, but the situation would definitely be different. Moreover, his ability to control his gains would definitely be stronger than now. His ability to control his gains would be stronger. Although there would be fewer surprises, it would allow him to avoid more detours and avoid more fruitless returns. Perhaps both had their strengths, but for true cultivators, they clearly looked forward to the ability to control their gains and not the so-called surprises. Therefore, if he had a choice, Luo Fan was actually more willing to have a stronger control over his harvest, rather than getting more surprises like he did now. Even if the surprises he received were many times more than what he had expected, it would not change his attitude. After all, this was the attitude that a true cultivator should have. This was the attitude that one should have when they were truly responsible for themselves. If one placed everything on surprises and placed all of one's cultivation on the final uncertainty, it would be difficult to say what the outcome would be. Chapter 3206. As more and more possibilities were occupied by Luo Fan's avatar in Luo Fan's mind, the time he experienced was becoming longer and longer. 10 billion years, 100 billion years, a trillion years, 10 trillion years, 100 trillion years, 1,000 trillion years. With every additional future possibility occupied, he felt as if he had experienced nearly 100 million years more. Just like that, with thousands of possibilities occupied, it felt as if the time he had experienced had been increased by trillions of years. During these trillions of years, although Luo Fan couldn't wholeheartedly cultivate according to his own thoughts, he needed to follow the needs of the future possibilities. Everything he thought had to be in line with the possibilities and his situation. However, that was still trillions of years. During such a long time, even if he had 1% of his time to cultivate and think, it would be an extremely huge gain for him. And obviously, among those future possibilities, Luo Fan's avatar naturally couldn't only take out 1% of his time to cultivate and think. Therefore, during these trillions of years, Luo Fan seemed to have wholeheartedly cultivated for trillions of years. Obviously, the value of trillions of years of cultivation was unimaginable to him. For a long time, Luo Fan's cultivation process had given people an extremely urgent feeling, as if something was chasing after him from behind. Although the speed of his progress was beyond imagination, in the end, he still lacked some accumulation. He couldn't be like an ordinary cultivator, who had enough time to slowly polish his own realm, his own self, his own mentality, and even his own ideas, his own worldview, and everything else. This was especially so after he stepped into the tribulation realm. Every time, he would only be able to take a breather and have a little bit of time during the Great Calamity. Usually, outside of the Great Tribulation, the arrival of the Great Tribulation was like a sharp sword hanging over his head, constantly pressuring him, forcing him to seize all the time he had to work hard to cultivate, forcing him to seize all the time he had to grow. That was the only way he would have enough time and strength to grow to a high enough level to face the challenge of the Great Tribulation. Even though he had heard from the disciples of the true saint that the Great Tribulation was an opportunity for those who walked the path of the reverse and was the focus of cultivation, the Great Tribulation was still a Great Tribulation. No matter how fated it was, no matter how important it was to cultivation, it was still a predestined fate. As long as it was a tribulation, there would naturally be a test. As long as it was a tribulation, there would naturally be a disaster. In the face of this tribulation, if he was not strong enough, then no matter how many fortuitous encounters there were or how beneficial it was to his cultivation, it would be meaningless to him. After all, he would be eliminated by the power of the tribulation the moment he came into contact with it. Under such circumstances, even if there were countless profundities and fortuitous encounters hidden behind this tribulation, what meaning did it have to him? It was precisely because of this that even if he was clearly aware that the tribulation was a fortuitous encounter and the tribulation was the main point of cultivation, he absolutely didn't dare to carelessly face the tribulation, and he absolutely didn't dare to take the sharp sword that hung high above his head as food that was delivered to his doorstep. He would definitely make the best use of all his time to cultivate. Under such circumstances, it went without saying how urgent his cultivation was. As such, how would he have the effect of settling his cultivation? How could he be like an ordinary cultivator who had enough time to slowly cultivate and slowly chew on his gains bit by bit? Even if in the eyes of ordinary cultivators, his rate of improvement was already so fast that it was enough to make them feel despair, and they no longer had any desire to compete with him. They would not be able to change the flaw in his cultivation method. This time, with the wonders of the division of Tao fruits, Luo Fan found an opportunity to make up for all of this. At that moment, he relied on occupying countless possibilities in the future and turning the time involved in those possibilities into his own cultivation time. He used this time to settle his cultivation, allowing him to obtain a long period of leisure that he had not obtained for countless billions of years. During this leisure, his cultivation realm did not increase by much. He was still stuck at the peak of the seventh tribulation, still a step away from the eighth tribulation. However, the feeling that he gave off was extremely different from before. In the past, no matter how much he tried to hide it, the feeling that he gave off was that he was powerful, mysterious, and possessed supreme might that could destroy the world. However, the current him, at least after obtaining the accumulation of time from the countless possibilities in the future, had an additional sense of ordinary. If he was willing, no one would be able to see anything extraordinary about him, even if they were also seventh tribulation powerhouses. Although this was only a change on the surface of his aura, it already meant that his control over his body had taken a huge step forward compared to before. Furthermore, apart from the substantial change in his body, more importantly, there was an additional sense of leisure in his heart. A kind of leisure that had never appeared on him before. At that moment, he suddenly vaguely understood why those true sages took in so many disciples. After all, after obtaining the split Tao fruit, he already had some guesses about the abilities of true sages. He knew that to true sages, the past, the present, and the future were all just a state to them. From the moment they became true sages, they had already seen through everything that would happen billions of years later. They even knew what kind of disciples they would take in, how far those disciples could go, whether they would become true sages in the end, and so on and so forth. All of this was already clear to them. If one were to take it a step further, they themselves were already experiencing the past, the present, and the endless possibilities of the future at the same time. Under such circumstances, if they only wanted to find a true sage companion like them, to find a true sage who could also obtain eternity and be undefeatable, they would obviously not open their doors and accept a large number of disciples like they were doing now. After all, if they knew what kind of disciple they were going to accept before they accepted the disciple, and what kind of achievement the disciple would have in the end, they only needed to slightly change their decision and directly choose the disciple who could become a true sage in the future and become their companion. Wouldn't it be fine? And obviously, according to what they had seen and heard, even among the disciples of true sages, only a few 100 million of them could become true sages in the end, if they really wanted to change their way of doing things. The number of disciples that those true sages took in would at least be reduced by a few 100 million times. However, it was obvious that those true sages did not do that. Even though they had clearly seen through everything, they did not have any intention of changing their way of doing things. They still took in all those true sages who were supposed to be their disciples as disciples. Even if doing so would increase the number of their disciples by a few 100 million times, even if it would increase the number of cultivators who carried the title of true sages to a shocking degree, it was still the same. Previously, Luo Fan found it hard to understand all of this. He even almost thought that so many disciples of true sages had actually been screened out and they were all cultivators who could become true sages after many years and many changes. However, it was obvious that even now, after his mentality had changed, although he still could not completely understand why those true sages did this, he could already understand a little about it. To those true sages, perhaps training these disciples was just a way of adjusting the situation, perhaps to ordinary cultivators, or even to those disciples of true sages, they were extremely concerned about the disciples of true sages and had even paved the way for them. However, in reality, to them, all of this was just a thought, a mere thought. And to those who had already become true sages, these thoughts were something that they did not care about at all. Even if, in the end, these thoughts were proven to be a waste of effort, they did not care at all. Of course, this was just a shallow guess of the mentality of true sages. Even Luo Fan, who had made this guess, knew that this guess was extremely unreliable. It was just a kind of distortion of the mentality of true sages that was caused by his current mentality. However, no matter what, compared to the past, it was still a kind of improvement. From not understanding to being able to understand slightly, this itself was a huge kind of improvement. Even if this kind of understanding was actually just a kind of distorted understanding, it was still the same. In actual fact, if one really thought about it, the reason why those true sages took in so many disciples of true sages was probably because, in certain possibilities in the future, they had tried to train these disciples of true sages, to true sages. As long as they had been trained in any possibility, they were already their real disciples. After all, to such existences, the countless possibilities in the past, present and future were obviously equivalent. No matter what stage it was at, no matter what the possibility was, as long as it happened, it would really happen. Currently, Luo Fan still could not really understand this kind of realm. In fact, it was hard for him to even imagine it. However, obviously, from the current situation of dividing the fruit of Tao, this situation was extremely likely. To a true sage, in certain possibilities, he had already taken in some existence as a disciple. Then, that existence would be his real disciple. He would not deny this fact, just because that disciple did not become a true sage in those possibilities and seemed to have wasted his training. To take in all the disciples that he had taken in before as a disciple in the present, This kind of thing was still unimaginable to ordinary cultivators. After all, the future was endless, but there was only one present. If he took in all the disciples that he had taken in all the possibilities in the future, then the number of disciples would probably reach a level of limitless. And to ordinary cultivators, this was obviously unbearable. Therefore, ordinary cultivators could not imagine this kind of situation. However, obviously, this was only the limitation of ordinary cultivators. To existences of true sage stage, limitless was obviously no longer an obstacle. To existences of true sage stage, limitless was perhaps just an extremely ordinary state. It was as if there was only one, or as if there was a certain amount of ordinary states. Therefore, to accept countless disciples that he had taken in all the possibilities in the future as disciples in the present at the same time, this kind of possibility became possible. This was also why it was so incomparably natural, without the slightest bit of abruptness, and without the slightest bit of reluctance. As for what exactly was the mystery behind this, existences that were not true sages would obviously find it difficult to understand. It was obvious that Luo Fan was not a true sage now. Therefore, to him, this was still a secret hidden in the fog. This also proved that the view of true sages as mixed-essence Tao fruits was just a fallacy. Even if this view had already revealed the first part of the nature of true sages, it was still only a drop in the ocean, the tip of the iceberg. With that almost limitless time, during the process of cultivation, Luo Fan had thought of all sorts of messy things. Even if it was obviously fruitless, he had done research on the nature of true sages before. Therefore, he was naturally very clear about these things. As Luo Fan occupied more and more possibilities, the evolution of the endless heaven and earth calamity was gradually distorted by him. Or rather, it could not be said to be distorted. Instead, it was gradually guided by him to an ending that the endless heaven and earth calamity could not have originally produced. This ending was none other than to allow the endless heaven and earth to obtain great growth and unimaginable sublimation. The past, the present, and the future were three states of time that were closely connected. The past was one and would never change. The present was one and only, but it was constantly changing. As for the future, it had infinite possibilities and was also changing endlessly. The present would become the past, and the possibilities of the future would also be restrained into the present. Therefore, the past, the present, and the future were so closely connected that from a certain point of view, they seemed to be one. Therefore, if one wanted to change the future and guide the possibilities of the future, one obviously could not limit one's vision to the possibilities of the future. In fact, one could not even limit one's vision to the possibilities of the future and the present. Instead, one had to look back into the past. Chapter 3207. Due to the close connection between the past, present, and future, if one wanted to change the direction of the future and change the possibility of the future, they had to start from the past. In other words, occupying the possibility of the future could indeed change the direction of the future, changing the possibility of the future into the probability of the present. However, this change could not be completed directly within the possibility of the future. Instead, it had to be connected to the present, the past, and the future. All three had to work at the same time to achieve this. Thus, if one wanted to change the direction of the future, they had to start from the past. Luo Fan quickly understood this point. Thus, during the process of cultivation, he began to combine the many possibilities of the future that he occupied and began to adjust the endless world bit by bit in the past. Through this adjustment, the present of the endless world unknowingly underwent all sorts of indescribable changes. Due to this change, the Transcendents suddenly realized that the difficulty of the tribulations seemed to have decreased a lot for them without them realizing it. All sorts of nodes that they would have found extremely difficult in the past were now extremely easy to deal with when they truly encountered them. It felt as if the conditions were right and success was achieved without any obstruction. They had already broken through the layers of obstacles and stood at a height that they had never dared to imagine in the past. How could it be so smooth? It feels like this tribulations aren't as difficult as I imagined. This thought flashed through the minds of the transcendent. However, after having this thought, they faintly had an indescribable feeling, as if there was something wrong with this matter. This was not the first time they had such a feeling. The last time they had this feeling was when Luo Fan changed the past and adjusted the characteristics of the living beings in a certain world. This caused the living beings in that world to be included in the world constructed by the endless tribulations and obtain the same qualifications as them to accept the trials of the tribulations. This was because as transcendents, they could faintly sense the changes in the past, but they could not truly sense it clearly. Because they could sense it but could not clearly sense it, they clearly knew that something was wrong, but they did not know exactly what it was. Time slowly passed, and in the blink of an eye, the present had moved forward hundreds of thousands of years. Hundreds of thousands of years later, the world constructed by the endless tribulation of the world finally collapsed completely. A large number of transcendents rushed out from the world and stood in the void, where the ruins of the world were. These supreme transcendents were all at a loss at this moment. It was as if everything that was happening before their eyes was completely beyond their expectations and even beyond their understanding. The current situation was indeed incomprehensible to them. They were clearly undergoing the test of the endless heaven and earth tribulations, or rather, they were clearly undergoing the test of the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation. According to the information transmitted by the endless tribulation of heaven and earth, they originally had to walk through that path in order to escape. But now, most of them still hadn't taken that path, yet they'd actually escaped and escaped the restraints of the tribulation. How could they not be surprised by this situation? What in the world happened? It can't be that the tribulation suddenly changed its mind, right? A supreme transcendent said in disbelief. The one who said that the combination wasn't as strong as imagined was a supreme transcendent who had walked the path. Although the majority of supreme transcendents didn't manage to do so, in fact, after hundreds of thousands of years, there were still a large number of powerful supreme transcendents who had walked this path. And this transcendent who had just spoken was one of those transcendent who hadn't taken the correct path. At this moment, the void trembled. Mysterious rays of light emerged from the depths of the void and gradually condensed in front of the supreme transcendents, taking the form of cultivators. These are the missing fifth tribulation experts. At this moment, many supreme transcendents came to this conclusion. The cultivators that had just emerged from the light did not exude much of a formidable aura. Rather, it felt as though they were just ordinary cultivators that had taken shape. However, all the supreme transcendents could instantly sense the extraordinariness of these existences and were certain of their identities. The reason for this was because some of the supreme transcendents were familiar with these fifth tribulation experts. More importantly, although these fifth tribulation experts didn't reveal anything extraordinary, their intrinsic quality was so high that the supreme transcendents could clearly sense that they were even more unfathomable than the fourth tribulation experts. Compared to the fourth tribulation experts, who were even more unfathomable and hadn't reached the level of the sixth tribulation experts, they could only be the fifth tribulation experts who had disappeared earlier. At this time, after the fifth tribulation experts appeared, although they were a little confused, most of them immediately began to activate their own power, their own minds, and their realms began to rapidly rise. Instead, he directly began to break through. While the supreme transcendents were struggling in that part of the world, the fifth tribulation experts weren't idle either. They had also seen the entire exploration process of those fourth tribulation experts. In fact, compared to the fourth tribulation experts, because their realms were higher and they were more familiar with the path, they obtained much more than the fourth tribulation experts. Under such circumstances, as the transcendent experts surpassed their limits one after another, they were also constantly improving themselves and surpassing themselves in the process. However, because of the suppression and restrictions of the endless tribulation, they couldn't directly break through their limits and break through their realms. Under such circumstances, when that part of the world completely collapsed and the suppression of the endless heaven and earth tribulation completely disappeared, there was no need to say what they would choose. These fifth tribulation experts were able to be sent to another camp by the endless tribulation expert. Their exploration of the path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation naturally had a certain standard. Although not all of them were at the peak of the fifth tribulation and were only one step away from breaking through the fifth tribulation and becoming a sixth tribulation expert, at least most of them were already at this level. Under such circumstances, the real shackles that prevented them from breaking through were obviously the path. In this way, now that the path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation had truly appeared in front of them, their breakthroughs would naturally be smoother than they had imagined. Therefore, at this time, most of their breakthroughs were extremely smooth. It didn't take long for the number of sixth tribulation experts born in the endless world to increase by thousands. Compared to the number of sixth tribulation experts in the endless world, it was insignificant. It was even like a drop of water compared to the boundless ocean. However, compared to the past, this was already a qualitative breakthrough. In the past, the cultivators born in the endless world were at most 5 tribulation experts. Compared to the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, they were still one level lower. After all, in the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, all the cultivators were 6 tribulation experts. In the past, even the strongest cultivators cultivated in the endless world were only 5 tribulation experts. It was not an exaggeration to say that the gap was so big that it was like the difference between heaven and earth. Now, although there were only thousands of 6th tribulation experts, for the endless world, it was already a huge gap that had been crossed. It could be said that they had stepped from the ground to the void, from the bottom of the earth to the top of the clouds. This could be considered as finally making up for the last half step of the Tao Master's path. The other half step had already been taken when the true path from the 5th tribulation to the 6th tribulation was born in the endless world. As the level crossed, the endless world seemed to suddenly stabilize. The boundless heavenly tribulation, which was still brewing and ready to pounce again, suddenly stopped. Then it disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared in the first place. However, with this change, the endless heavenly tribulation actually disappeared just like that. It should be known that under normal circumstances, the endless world tribulation would not disappear just like that. The previous wave of tribulation was a disaster that was close to despair for many transcendents in the endless world, and it even almost caused the endless world to lose more than 90% of the world. But in the end, that was only the first wave of the second endless world tribulation. Even if this tribulation had lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, and normally, it would have lasted for millions of years, the first tribulation was still the first tribulation. Normally, after this wave of tribulation, there would be an endless stream of tribulations that would continuously flood over and drown all life in the endless world. Strong start but weak finish? At this time, the transcendents who sensed this change didn't dare to believe their senses. This was the endless tribulation of the heavens and earth. Normally speaking, it was a disaster that they would only have a slim chance of survival. But at this time, this disaster actually passed without a sound. How could they not be shocked? Then, here's the question. Can we be considered to have passed the tribulation or not? Someone who transcended beyond the world asked with some hesitation. The other transcendents looked at each other in dismay, unable to determine the current situation. The 5th tribulation experts' breakthroughs had gradually calmed down. Although thousands of supreme transcending experts succeeded in breaking through, it was clear that most of the 5th tribulation experts failed in the end. After all, even if they had a clear path, they still wouldn't be able to reach the heavens in a single step. Even if they had failed, these fifth tribulation experts didn't die just because they failed. However, even though they failed, these fifth tribulation experts didn't die just because they failed to break through. Thus, during the process of breaking through, they still left a way out for themselves and didn't risk everything. Thus, during the process of breaking through, they still left a way out for themselves and didn't risk everything. In this way, even if they failed, they would only be injured and they wouldn't die. Of course, looking at it from another angle, perhaps it was because they didn't put everything on the line that led to their failure. However, there was no point in thinking about this now. Things had already happened, and they weren't Luo Fan. How could they change the past? It's more difficult than I imagined. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the midst of splitting the fruits, sighed. He had already stopped cultivating. In other words, he didn't try to forcefully occupy the future. Because he didn't continue to occupy the possibility of the future, time naturally returned to its normal state for him and began to move forward in the normal way. In other words, the future started to shrink and turned into his present. In reality, the reason why the second endless world tribulation disappeared so anticlimactic was because he changed the past to adjust the future. As for how he changed the past, it was hard to say. After all, there were simply too many details, and the plan was too far-reaching. If they were to be truly described, perhaps even billions of words might not be enough to describe them clearly. And through this change, the final result was that although he could be considered to have succeeded initially, he still did not completely achieve his goal in the end. In the end, he only managed to silently eliminate the second endless world tribulation, but he did not completely transform the endless world tribulation into the benefits of the endless world that he had originally envisioned. In the end, it's still a tribulation that comes from the state of chaos. It's still too difficult to completely change its nature. In the end, he could only sigh with emotion. Turning the test brought by the endless world tribulation into benefits for the endless world tribulation was equivalent to turning the tribulation into a fortuitous opportunity. Clearly, this was already a change in nature. Changing one's nature was the most difficult no matter what it was targeted at. Now, to be able to do this and easily eliminate the endless heavenly tribulations without bringing about too much of a disaster, this was already extremely rare. The failure of his efforts this time also made Luo Fan truly understand that even if he had the fruit of the way, not everything would go smoothly. Chapter 3208. The limitation of the Dao fruit was not only because the Dao fruit he had was just a split Dao fruit, but it was the fundamental limitation of all Dao fruits. In other words, even if it wasn't a split Dao fruit but a primordial Dao fruit, it was still very likely to have such a limitation. After all, the split Dao fruit in this endless world was actually very similar to the primordial Dao fruit in the chaotic state of all the worlds. Under such circumstances, the split Dao fruit in this endless world was very likely to be the primordial Dao fruit's limitation in the chaotic state of all the worlds. And while this prevented Luo Fan from deifying the primordial Dao fruit too much, it also proved one of his previous ideas. That was, the primordial Dao fruit might be able to describe some of the characteristics of a true divine, but it was definitely only a very small part of the many characteristics of a true divine. For a true divine, there were even more unimaginable characteristics. And these characteristics were still something that Luo Fan could not understand, and even more unimaginable from a certain point of view. This failure also made Luo Fan understand a true divine a step further. Even if it was just recognizing that the characteristics of a true divine were far beyond what he had imagined, it was still a step further. As for Luo Fan's thoughts, it was naturally impossible for those who had transcended to know about it. At this moment, those transcendents were still puzzled by the anticlimactic ending of the second endless tribulation of heaven and earth. And with such puzzlement, they returned to their homeland, their own world. They began to work hard to restore the various disturbances that occurred in their world after they left for so many years. Without their suppression, their world naturally could not be as stable as it was when they were here. During these years, their world had undergone many changes that had not been there when they were here, and many problems that had not been there before. They needed to deal with all these problems, and the faster they dealt with it, the better. Because of this, at this time, even the shock caused by the breakthroughs of the fifth tribulation experts was not enough to make them stay where they were. Instead, they all returned as fast as they could to their own world, their homeland, to deal with the various problems there. Perhaps it was because the endless tribulation of the world wasn't being eliminated in a normal way, so the world barrier that should have disappeared along with the endless tribulation of the world still existed. Even though its essence was weakening bit by bit with the passage of time, and in the foreseeable future, it would definitely completely collapse and disappear at some point in time. But now was not the time. Even now, the heavenly barrier still existed around this endless world, completely isolating this endless world from the outside world's sixth level of the Tao Sovereign's path. Therefore, the flow of time in the endless world was still in a relatively independent state. The amount of time spent here had nothing to do with the amount of time spent in the outside world. It was also because of this that the connection between the sixth tribulation powerhouses and the outside world, as well as the connection between them and their bodies, was still in an indistinct state. In the face of such a situation, those sixth tribulation powerhouses clearly didn't know that their past had been completely changed by some existence countless times. Of course, according to the development trend of the barrier, it was only a matter of time before they discovered this. As for when exactly they would discover this, it would depend on when the heavenly barrier outside the endless world disappeared. Before the heavenly barrier disappeared, the possibility of them discovering this was very small. But once the heavenly barrier disappeared, the change would be as clear as a palm print to them. Of course, in fact, they didn't have to wait for the heavenly barrier to disappear completely. As long as the heavenly barrier weakened to below the perfect heaven and earth level at some point, the effect of the heavenly barrier disappearing would appear. After all, strictly speaking, once the heaven and earth barrier weakened to a level below that of a perfect heaven and earth barrier, it was equivalent to the current heaven and earth barrier disappearing. Although there were still heaven and earth barriers remaining, they were no longer heaven and earth barriers of this level, but heaven and earth barriers of a lower level. Of course, although it depended on the time when the barrier disappeared, it was completely random as to how long it would take to disappear in the outside world. After all, the flow of time inside and outside was in a relatively independent state. In this state, no matter how much time passed inside, it could be any length of time in the outside world. Perhaps hundreds of trillions of years passed inside, but only a few moments passed outside. Or perhaps conversely, hundreds of trillions of years passed outside, but only a few moments passed inside. As for the specifics, it was reasonable for such a relatively independent flow of time. Of course, Luo Fan was not worried about the possibility that hundreds of trillions of years passed outside, but only a moment passed inside the heavenly barrier. The reason for this was very simple. Because at this time, it was not only the relative independence of time that affected the comparison of time between the two. It was also the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road that affected the comparison of time. In the past, the level of the heavenly barrier was lower than that of the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. In fact, the relationship between the two was not too close, and the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road did not have a strong influence on the comparison of time. In that case, when the heavenly barrier disappeared, the randomness of the comparison of time would be stronger. It was like the real world and the movie. In the past, the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road was equivalent to the real world, while the heavenly barrier was equivalent to the virtual world shown in the movie. Obviously, the time correlation between the two was quite weak. The time span of a movie might be countless years, But for the real world, a movie was at most a few hours. In other words, the correlation between the time between the two was quite weak. But obviously, the relationship between the heavenly barrier and the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road was completely different. If the movie and the real world were compared, the heavenly barrier in the past was just equivalent to the virtual world in the movie. But now, a native sixth tribulation expert had been born in the endless world, and there was already a complete path to the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. His essence had obviously improved by many times compared to before. From the perspective of the movie and the real world, it was like the originally illusory movie world had gradually gained the attribute of reality. In other words, the movie world had gradually become the real world. Obviously, once there was such a change, the time in the movie world naturally couldn't be set as casually as before. It had to follow the rules of the real world. Although it was not necessarily the time that had passed in the real world, the time that had been turned into the movie world was obviously not equivalent to a few hours, no matter how long it had been. At this time, the heavenly barrier was the same. After its essence had been improved, the flow of time was obviously no longer able to get rid of the influence of the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. Even if there was a perfect heaven and earth barrier separating it from the outside world, it would still be the same. Therefore, after the perfect heaven and earth barrier disappeared, there was indeed a certain degree of randomness between how much time had passed between the endless heaven and earth and how much time had passed on the sixth level of the Road of Tao Master. But this kind of randomness could not deviate from the time rules of the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. What did this mean? That was to say, it was normal that no matter how many years had passed on the Tao Master's Road, many more years had passed in the heavenly barrier. This was not a problem. However, if it was said that many years had passed in the heavenly barrier and many more years had passed on the Tao Master's Road, this was impossible. As for the reverse, it was even more impossible for the sixth level of the Tao Master to reverse the flow of time and even return to the time before the endless tribulation of heaven and earth disappeared. How many years had passed in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path? Although this situation also belonged to the category of randomness of time, as for why this was the case, it was naturally because the flow of time in the heavenly barrier and the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road was already there. In other words, for the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road, the flow of time in the heavenly barrier should be much faster than the outside world. Under such circumstances, the heavenly barrier had to follow the rules of the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. After the heaven and earth barrier disappeared, the comparison of time between the two naturally had to conform to this direction. Although the specific value could be adjusted to a certain extent, this was the influence of the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. Time passed quickly. In the blink of an eye, hundreds of thousands of years had passed in the heavenly barrier. On this day, after being weakened for hundreds of thousands of years, the heaven and earth barrier, or in other words, the heaven and earth barrier outside the islands, had finally weakened to a certain limit. As this limit was crossed, the heavenly barrier and the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road, which had originally been completely separated, were once again connected. Although the heaven and earth barrier still existed at this time and still had a certain blocking effect on the communication between the inside and the outside world, the connection between the main body and the incarnation was no longer blocked. In just an instant, the sixth tribulation experts whose incarnations had entered the heavenly barrier instantly felt that the connection between themselves and the incarnations had been re-established. At the same time, everything that the incarnations had experienced flowed through their hearts in the blink of an eye. Sure enough, it's another tribulation. For the first time, the sixth tribulation experts sighed with emotion. As for the sudden formation of the barrier between the heavenly barrier and the outside world, which completely separated the two, they didn't know exactly what was going on, nor did they know the reason for all of this. However, as sixth tribulation experts, their knowledge was enough to make a lot of guesses. Among them, the guess that the heavenly barrier was encountering some kind of tribulation against the heavenly barrier became the most likely possibility in their cognition. However, no matter how certain they were, guesses were after all just guesses. Before they could really confirm it, there were still other possibilities. Therefore, at this time, when they recommunicated with the incarnations, they immediately confirmed whether their guesses were correct. Because of this, they all sighed with emotion. Millions of years had passed in the heavenly barrier, until now in the heavenly barrier. But for the outside world, the time that had passed was not as fast as the normal flow of time between the heavenly barrier and the outside world. It was less than a breath. Instead, it was more than hundreds of years. The millions of years inside were only hundreds of years in the outside world. The difference in the flow of time was actually quite large. If it were in other places, this kind of time comparison would be enough to make people sigh with emotion about the speed of time in the heavenly barrier. However, it was obvious that the flow of time in the heavenly barrier was indescribably slow when compared to the time between the heavenly barrier and the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. After all, in the heavenly barrier, the flow of time in the heavenly barrier was billions of times faster than the outside world. According to the normal flow of time, a single breath in the outside world would be equivalent to trillions of years in the endless world. Under such circumstances, the time that had passed in the heavenly barrier, which was calculated in millions of years in the heavenly barrier, was obviously far less than a breath in the outside world. From this point of view, the millions of years in the heavenly barrier were now hundreds of years in the outside world, which was obviously unimaginably slow. And this change also became the time ratio standard between the heavenly barrier and the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. Although before this change was completely random, the moment this result appeared, the new standard had already been set. This was like the width of the railway track. In fact, the width of the railway track was not necessary. In other words, it didn't mean that the railway tracks had to be so wide in order to meet certain requirements and allow the train to run properly. In fact, the reason why the railway track was set to the current width was because the original standard width of the road was the same. The original standard for the road was the standard for carriages, and the standard for carriages was the width of the horse's buttocks. Chapter 3209. It was the same for the time ratio between the endless world and the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. Before this, the ratio between the two could be any one of them. Moreover, the possibility of any one of them happening was the same, except that it had to conform to the principle of the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. There was no one who was more likely to happen, and no one could say which ratio was more likely to happen. However, now that this possibility had been randomly selected, the situation was obviously completely different. As this possibility was randomly selected, the situation was completely different. From this moment on, the possibility of the time ratio was no longer a possibility, but had been completely determined. Because, among the countless possibilities, one had stood out and become a reality. Even if this reality was the most common and ordinary possibility among the countless possibilities, or even a possibility that was not special at all. But since it had finally stood out, it was the final result. For example, the width of a train track could originally be any width, as long as it conformed to the principle of the train, such as not being smaller than the width of a person. However, when the track was originally laid according to the width of the road, its width had already been determined. Even if this width had no special benefits for the track or the train, it was still the same. Therefore, at this moment, the moment the perfect level world barrier around the endless world disappeared, the difference in the flow of time between the endless world and the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road was more than 1,000,000 years in the endless world, which was equivalent to the ratio of hundreds of years in the outside world. From now on, the time ratio between the endless world and the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road was completely determined. As for the original effect of Luo Fan on the distortion of time in the endless world, because of the joint effect of the endless world and the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road, it had become a supporting force to maintain the current time ratio between the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road and the endless world. What a pity! Feeling that the time ratio had been fixed at this ratio, Luo Fan could not help but secretly feel pity. Although the flow of time in the endless world was still many times faster than the flow of time in the outside world, it was obviously tens of thousands of times slower than the original time in the outside world, where trillions of years would pass in a breath. This slowing down of time clearly caused the value of the endless world to decrease by a lot. In the past, with that unimaginable ratio of time, it wouldn't take long, at most a few thousand years or tens of thousands of years for him to have the opportunity to see the path of development in the endless world, from the sixth tribulation to the seventh tribulation. Once the Tao of this level was developed, the endless heaven and earth would, to a certain extent, be above the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. At that time, it was worth looking forward to what kind of transformation it would undergo. If such a metamorphosis were to occur, Luo Fan would be looking forward to how much he would benefit from it. However, it was a pity that this advantage was gone. Although the flow of time in the endless world was still many times faster than the flow of time in the outside world. However, he was no longer as extreme as before. After losing that extremity, the connection between the endless heaven and earth and the sixth level of the road to Tao Master naturally became much closer. Once this connection became stronger, the outside world's influence on the boundless world would naturally become stronger. Once the influence was strengthened, it would obviously not be easy for the endless heaven and earth to develop its own Tao. With a ready-made breakthrough path and a ready-made breakthrough environment, how could those transcendent experts wholeheartedly open up the path from the sixth tribulation to the seventh tribulation? Once they were unable to open up the path wholeheartedly, the hope of the path appearing would obviously be extremely slim. As for directly transferring the sixth level of the road to Tao Master from the sixth tribulation to the seventh level to the endless heaven and earth, it was even more impossible. Although they were both Tao paths of the same realm, the development direction of the endless heaven and earth was obviously completely different from the development direction of the sixth level of the road to Tao Master. If the Tao path of the sixth level of the road to Tao Master was directly transferred to the endless heaven and earth, there could only be one final result. That was, the Tao path of the sixth level of the road to Tao Master would directly devour the Tao paths in the endless heaven and earth, causing the Tao paths in the endless heaven and earth to be completely assimilated. Once that step was reached, there was obviously only one result, that was, the characteristics of the endless heaven and earth would be completely destroyed. The endless heaven and earth would also completely become one of the countless extremely ordinary cultivation places in the sixth level of the road to Tao Master. This was obviously a great waste. An existence that could originally walk a brand new Tao path would eventually fade into the crowd. No matter from which angle one looked at it, it was worthy of a sigh of regret. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan felt such a pity at this time. However, compared to other cultivation places, the endless heaven and earth still had an advantage, and that was it was divided into Tao fruit. As a Tao fruit, its essence was ultimately still different from other cultivation places. And this difference, at this time, was the last hope of the endless heaven and earth. Because of this difference, even if the endless heaven and earth was only one step away from becoming the crowd, it still had the possibility of maintaining its own characteristics. And to maintain this possibility, the method was actually very obvious, that was, to still separate the endless heaven and earth from the sixth level of the road to Tao Master as much as possible. Only by separating the two as much as possible could the previous state of the endless heaven and earth be recreated. Even if the flow of time had been greatly slowed down, the endless heaven and earth could continue to develop as before. Of course, from a certain point of view, this method was unfair to the many people in the endless heaven and earth who had transcended. After all, if the two were not separated, the people in the endless heaven and earth who had transcended could easily find the path they wanted to find in the sixth level of the road to Tao Master. In this way, although this characteristic did not conform to the characteristics of the endless heaven and earth that Luo Fan wanted to maintain, for the people in the endless heaven and earth who had transcended, it allowed them to set foot on the right path without suffering or groping in the dark. In this way, although it did not mean that they would have a greater chance of breaking through, at least in the process of breaking through, they would encounter fewer obstacles in the process of breaking through. And for the people in the endless heaven and earth who had transcended, this was actually a considerable benefit, enough for them to focus most of their energy on breaking through. And to a certain extent, this was obviously enough to increase their chances of breaking through. Most importantly, it was much easier than groping in the dark. In contrast, if the two were separated, then for the people in the endless heaven and earth who had transcended, their situation was no different from that in the past countless years. They still had to grope in the dark, and they still had to hit walls countless times before they could find the right path to their destination. In the end, they might even directly hit their heads and bleed in the boundless darkness, unable to find the right path at all. The difference between the two could be imagined. In this way, if the two were separated, it would be even more unfair to the people in the endless heaven and earth who had transcended. But obviously, at this time, Luo Fan did not consider whether this was fair to the people in the endless heaven and earth who had transcended. At this time, what he was thinking about was how to maintain the characteristics of the endless heaven and earth, and how to make the fruit of the way have a better development and a better future. Compared to this, what was a little unfair to the people in the endless heaven and earth. When considering the separation of the endless heaven and earth and the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, Luo Fan did not consider the influence of the foreign experts of the Sixth Tribulation. After all, the experts of the Sixth Tribulation were only the doppelgangers, incarnations, or projections of the experts of the Sixth Tribulation. And why did these doppelgangers, projections, and incarnations enter the endless heaven and earth for? They came for the mysteries behind the endless heaven and earth, and for all kinds of things related to this mystery. But it was not for imparting the way of cultivation in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path into the endless heaven and earth, so that they could devour the way of cultivation in the endless heaven and earth. After all, they could not be sure how much this way of cultivation would affect the endless heaven and earth. Was it related to the mysteries behind the endless heaven and earth? If they were to devour this cultivation path, would it affect their goals? Because of this, most of the experts of the Sixth Tribulation would obviously try their best to avoid the sixth level of the Tao Master's path into the endless heaven and earth. Of course, there were all kinds of weirdos. Just like in the previous endless heaven and earth tribulations, there were also many experts of the Sixth Tribulation who did not follow the crowd and eventually lost their incarnations, even though they knew that it would be more beneficial for them to restrict the spread of the way of cultivation into the endless heaven and earth. But there were bound to be some experts of the Sixth Tribulation who could not control themselves and spread the sixth level of the Tao Master's path into the endless heaven and earth. But no matter what, these were only a small number. And if it was a small number, it would naturally be easier to deal with it. This was especially true for Luo Fan, who could freely move the past of the endless heaven and earth. Even if a Sixth Tribulation expert violated his taboo and caused serious consequences, he could modify the past by dividing the Tao fruit and finally reverse the serious consequences, so that the way of cultivation from the sixth level of the Tao Master's path into the endless heaven and earth would never spread. With such a backup plan, Luo Fan naturally did not need to worry about the impact of the Sixth Tribulation experts on the independence of the endless heaven and earth. While Luo Fan was thinking about what to do next, Most of the 6 tribulation experts in the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path began to be shocked. At this moment, around the endless heaven and earth, or around the countless islands, when the perfect heaven and earth barrier was lowered, they were reconnected with their incarnations. And this connection allowed them to directly sense the abnormality in the memory of their incarnations. In other words, it allowed them to sense that everything that their incarnations had experienced in their memory was different from what their incarnations had experienced. In this case, there was obviously only one possibility, that was, the memory of their incarnations had been changed. And the establishment of these memories was completely based on history and all kinds of past experiences. Under such circumstances, this kind of memory had been changed, which meant that the past of these incarnations had been changed. The past has been changed. How is this possible? The past is eternal and unchanging. How can anyone change the past? Similar thoughts kept appearing in the minds of the 6th tribulation expert. How could the practitioners who could cultivate to the level of 6 tribulation experts have no understanding of the past, the present, and the future? And it was precisely because of their understanding of the characteristics of the past, the present, and the future that they were even more shocked at this time. If those creatures who had no understanding of the characteristics of the past, the present, and the future knew what these 6 tribulation experts knew, that the past had been changed, they would definitely be shocked. But the degree of shock was definitely not as much as these 6 tribulation experts. The reason for this was very simple, because they did not know how heaven-defying it was to change the past. For them, the point of their shock should be that someone could travel through time and space and manipulate the past at will, not that the past had been changed in the process. For them, there was no difference between the past and the future. In essence, there was no difference between changing the past and changing the future. Although, in their eyes, changing the future was already an extremely incredible achievement, but these 6 tribulation experts were different. They clearly knew that the past had already happened, and it was eternal. Any action that wanted to change the past would eventually be proved to be a part of the past. This was one of the driving forces behind the present appearance of the past. But at this time, everything they discovered through their incarnations told them that this understanding was very wrong. The past could indeed be changed, and it could be changed countless times. How could they not be shocked to discover such a subversive fact? How could they not feel that there was some kind of shocking secret hidden in it? Chapter 32:10. Who is changing the past? Can the past really be changed? Similar thoughts echoed in the minds of many 6th tribulation experts at this moment. The idea that the past could not be changed had long been common sense for many 6th tribulation experts. But now, this common sense was forcibly subverted in front of them, which was a great shock to them. At this moment, their minds were completely filled with this kind of subversion. 4 other things, such as the complete path that was born in the endless world, which was different from the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path, but could also lead to the 6 tribulation experts level. For example, the indescribable transformation of the endless world itself at this time, all of this seemed so insignificant compared to the fact that subverted their common sense. After all, in the eyes of those 6th tribulation experts, the endless world was just a very ordinary place of cultivation in the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path. Even if it was special for various special reasons, in essence, it was still a place of cultivation, just one of the countless places of cultivation in the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path. Compared to this, what they felt now was the first time in their hundreds of millions of years of cultivation that the past had been changed, distorted, and subverted. Between something that had never been seen before and something that subverted common sense, and something that was only a little special but had countless similar things, was there a need to say which one to choose? At this moment, many 6th tribulation experts had all kinds of inexplicable and complicated feelings about the endless world. There was anticipation and also some fear. Naturally, they were looking forward to exploring the mystery of the means to change the past. But what they were afraid of was that this means to change the past was completely beyond their own understanding, which made them feel that everything about them was so fragile and powerless in the eyes of the existence behind it. It seemed that as long as the existence behind it exerted a little force, everything about them could be erased. Under such circumstances, the real bodies of these sixth tribulation experts involuntarily came to the endless world. In other words, they came to the branches of the islands in the layers of the nothingness ocean. That kind of anticipation made them unable to help approaching the endless world. But fear made it impossible for them to make up their minds to enter the endless world. This kind of contradictory mentality led to their choice at this moment. As they continued to gather, the number of sixth tribulation experts around the layers of the nothingness ocean began to skyrocket like a geyser. The various settlements that the sixth tribulation experts had originally prepared were soon insufficient. New cities, new Taoist rites, new continents, and even new worlds and new islands quickly appeared around the layers of islands. With such changes, this island, which seemed to have become a relatively special place on the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, gradually became something like a core. At this time, even though Luo Fan's projection of the world of laws was still increasing at an unimaginable speed, it was no longer able to steal the attention of the many sixth tribulation powerhouses. Luo Fan even vaguely felt that the incarnations of the sixth tribulation powerhouses seemed to have become less active amidst the illusory world of laws. This is really unexpected. Luo Fan didn't know whether to laugh or cry at this time. These heaven and earth illusions were actually the focus of Luo Fan's planned cultivation. His cultivation goal was to find out the correlation function between the Great Way and the nomological law layer. This was also something that he had decided long ago. In contrast, the island branch was just a casual move that he had made to imitate the cultivation method of other sixth tribulation experts on the sixth level of the Tao Master's path and to explore some cultivation. But in the end, the achievements that he had made in his meticulous preparation for cultivation were completely suppressed by the casual move he had made. After all, his cultivation of countless heaven and earth illusions hadn't really achieved any results yet. On the other side, the island branch had already gathered into a Tao fruit, allowing him to get a glimpse of the means of a true sage. The gap between the achievements of the two could be imagined. But now, even in terms of attraction, the heaven and earth illusions on this side had actually been suppressed by the island branch. How could he not laugh or cry at this? Not to mention anything else, the number of incarnations that Luo Fan had invested in the heaven and earth illusions was now in the hundreds of millions. But on this side, the number of incarnations that he had invested in the heaven and earth illusions was only one. The disparity between the investment and the final result was self-evident. However, it was obvious that although he felt that the sixth tribulation experts in those heaven and earth illusions were much less active, Luo Fan didn't take any action to provoke them. The existence of those sixth tribulation experts was just the icing on the cake. For Luo Fan, what was really important was still his own cultivation. This was the conclusion that he had drawn in the process of countless heaven and earth illusions. Although the sixth tribulation experts played a significant role, they were ultimately just embellishment. If he treated their role as the focus and his own cultivation as embellishments, it would be like picking up sesame seeds and throwing away watermelons. Therefore, at this time, although the sixth tribulation experts' incarnations had become less active, causing his cultivation progress to slow down, Luo Fan still didn't care too much. After reminiscing for a while, Luo Fan turned his attention back to the countless shadows of the world of laws. After all, he had already handed over the cultivation on the island branch to the incarnation there, and now the incarnation was doing a perfect job, even beyond his imagination. Under such circumstances, he naturally didn't need to change this arrangement, even if it didn't seem wise for him to invest in these two sides at this time. It seemed that he should invest more energy in the endless heaven and earth illusions, or rather the splitting of the Tao fruits, and slightly restrain his strength in the heaven and earth illusions. The reason for this was, of course, not because he was stubborn, but because he clearly knew that accidents could often happen in cultivation. Accidents that were beneficial to him would happen, and accidents that were harmful to him would also happen. Now, the situation on the island branch seemed to be quite wonderful, and it was obviously an excellent accident. But this didn't mean that accidents would always be excellent. If he could change his cultivation rhythm because of this excellent accident, then wouldn't he have to change his cultivation rhythm even more when he encountered a bad accident in the future? If that was the case, wouldn't his cultivation rhythm become completely chaotic? And if his cultivation rhythm was completely chaotic, the cultivation efficiency would obviously be unimaginable. In order to avoid this outcome, sticking to the cultivation that he could control and treating accidents as accidents was obviously the wisest choice. After all, accidents were just accidents and not the norm. If he treated accidents as the main point and the cultivation that he could control as a secondary supplement, then he obviously couldn't distinguish the importance of it. Besides, there was no need for other incarnations to get involved in the island branch, the endless heaven and earth illusions, or the splitting of the Tao fruit. Just the incarnation there was already enough to control everything. But why would he need to disrupt his cultivation rhythm? On the other side, Luo Fan's incarnation, who was standing in the splitting of the Tao fruits, didn't care about the performance of the sixth tribulation experts at all. For the sixth tribulation experts, they had only decided to come to the island branch now, and only now were they prepared to personally use their methods to dig out the secrets contained in the island branch and change the past. However, this was only for them. For Luo Fan's incarnation here, their appearance had already been repeated in his eyes countless times. After all, to the current him, he had already occupied billions of future possibilities. Although compared to the endless possibilities of the future, the possibilities he occupied were still only a very, very small part of it, because the splitting of the Tao fruits could only be used in the endless heaven and earth. He didn't really see the existence of the sixth tribulation experts in those possibilities. However, this didn't mean that he couldn't understand whether the sixth tribulation experts appeared in those futures, what they did, and what happened. After all, although those sixth tribulation experts didn't personally step into the endless heaven and earth, but their existence would eventually have various effects on the endless heaven and earth. It was like a person facing the surface of the water would naturally cast his own image on the surface of the water. Even if he couldn't directly see the true bodies of those sixth tribulation experts, he couldn't directly see their true actions in those countless future possibilities. But through the changes that occurred in the endless heaven and earth because of their actions, he could naturally know that they appeared in those possibilities in the process. He could even infer what they did in those possibilities through those changes, and what happened in the end. Now that there were many possibilities, he only needed to integrate them, and he would naturally be able to make it seem as if he had seen everything with his own eyes. In this kind of possibility, he would be able to see what those sixth tribulation experts had done and what characteristics they had. In another possibility, what did they do, and what kind of special traits could he find out about them from it? In this way, among the countless possibilities, the different choices they made in different environments would reflect all aspects of them. In the end, Luo Fan was able to see through them clearly, and even more clearly and intuitively than seeing them with his own eyes. He also had a deeper understanding of them. Therefore, at this time, even if those sixth tribulation experts had just arrived, in the eyes of Luo Fan, they had almost no secret. At least, in terms of character, temperament, and the choices they made under various circumstances, there were no secrets for him anymore. And the number of these sixth tribulation experts was so large that it had to be counted in the trillions. Even if their number was not the total number of all the sixth tribulation experts in the entire sixth layer of the Tao Master's path, they were still at the same level. Having a deep understanding of so many sixth tribulation experts, in a way, it meant that he had a deep understanding of all the practitioners in the sixth layer of the Tao Master's path. And with a deep understanding of the practitioners, he could naturally deduce which of the various strange scenes in the sixth layer of the Tao Master's path were natural, and which were born because of these sixth tribulation experts. In this way, Luo Fan felt that his understanding of the sixth layer of the Tao Master's path had unknowingly deepened a little. All kinds of things that seemed mysterious, inexplicable, and unimaginable in the past seemed to be so orderly now, and there were all kinds of clear veins that could not be seen before. This could also be regarded as a kind of unexpected gain. From a certain point of view, I have achieved my original goal. At this time, such a thought flashed through the mind of Luo Fan's incarnation. He originally built the island to understand why those sixth tribulation experts, and even the practitioners who had ascended to the seventh layer of the Tao Master's path, would build an island in one of the layers of the nothingness ocean to cultivate on the sixth layer of the Tao Master's path. And this goal, in the final analysis, was ultimately to better understand the sixth layer of the Tao Master's path, and to better understand the various subtle mysteries of the sixth layer of the Tao Master's path. And obviously, at this time, he had clearly achieved this goal. Those sixth tribulation experts naturally did not know that Luo Fan had an extremely deep understanding of them through observing the possibilities of the future. At this moment, they were still nervous, expectant, and fearful as they probed the branches of the island, or in other words, the endless world, and the fruit of the way. As for the methods they used, there was naturally no need to say much. Naturally, there were all kinds of methods and all kinds of domains existed. After all, the number of these sixth tribulation experts was a terrifying scale that could be calculated in the trillions. With such a large scale, even if only 1 out of thousands of people used a different method from the others, in the end, the number of methods they used would inevitably reach a level that could not be compared. It was enough to occupy the possibility of all methods. It was precisely because of this that it was naturally meaningless to talk about their method. Chapter 32:11. However, there seems to be something wrong with these people. Although he felt that his understanding of the sixth tribulation experts had reached a depth that ordinary cultivators couldn't imagine, Luo Fan still felt that there were a few sixth tribulation experts who didn't seem to be like what he understood from the countless future possibilities. They seemed to have some kind of secret that he couldn't see through. And this almost meant that the cultivators who caught Luo Fan's attention were not simple themselves. After all, Luo Fan was able to see through these six tribulation powerhouses by relying on the countless future possibilities and the various traces they left behind in the endless world to come to this conclusion. In other words, it happened in the domain that the sixth tribulation experts couldn't detect at all. This conclusion was obviously the one closest to the truth. But even so, these cultivators were still able to hide their true secrets in front of him. How could they be simple? They aren't even seventh tribulation experts. Looking at these people, this thought suddenly flashed in Luo Fan's mind. In fact, there were actually many seventh tribulation experts hidden among the sixth tribulation experts. For Luo Fan, although these seventh tribulation experts were much more brilliant than sixth tribulation experts, they were still within the scope of his understanding. Through the analysis and research of countless future possibilities, he also almost completely saw through them. In this way, he now thought that these people weren't seventh tribulation experts. Of course, it wasn't that they were sixth tribulation experts, but above seventh tribulation, they might be eighth tribulation experts, and if he made a bold guess, they might even be ninth tribulation experts. Only by doing so would they be able to protect their secrets in front of Luo Fan in such a state. Thinking that these people might be eighth tribulation or even ninth tribulation experts, Luo Fan couldn't help but secretly look forward to it. After all, This was the first time he saw 8th tribulation or even 9th tribulation experts. In the past, the strongest existence below the true divine that he had ever seen was only a 7th tribulation expert. Obviously, true divine was not included in the scope of consideration. Therefore, within the scope of consideration, the few cultivators in front of him were most likely the strongest cultivators he had ever met in his life. Under such circumstances, how could he not have high expectations for these cultivators? After all, these cultivators possessed the mysteries of 8 or even 9 tribulations. Of course, although he was looking forward to it, Luo Fan did not let go of his vigilance against these cultivators. Even if he had the split Tao fruit and seemed to have some of the characteristics of a true saint, he was still a peak 7th tribulation expert. For someone like him, those 8 tribulation experts and even 9 tribulation experts were obviously stronger than him. At the very least, he was stronger than him in terms of cultivation level. Under such circumstances, even if he had some means that were more powerful than these 8 or 9 tribulations experts, it couldn't erase the fact that he was weaker than these 8 or 9 tribulations experts in some aspects. And these facts were obviously his relative weaknesses. For existences at the 8 or 9 tribulations level, their ability to seize the weaknesses was obviously not weak. In other words, Luo Fan might appear extremely weak in front of them. Even if he had means that could threaten these 8 or 9 tribulations experts, this weak characteristic also meant that he would become extremely dangerous when facing these cultivators. Clearly aware of this, how could Luo Fan be careless when facing these 8 or 9 tribulations experts? Among those cultivators, there were 8 that Luo Fan could see were shrouded in some kind of mist. That was to say, he could barely see that they were extraordinary, and could faintly feel that there was a certain intrinsic difference between them and other 6 tribulations experts. As for the last one, Luo Fan couldn't sense anything special about him at all. In other words, in Luo Fan's perception, there was nothing special about this person at all. He felt like an extremely ordinary 6 tribulations expert. If Luo Fan hadn't seen the countless future possibilities and determined his abnormality through the countless clues revealed in them, he might not have been able to pick him out from the billions of 6 tribulations experts at all. However, through the countless possibilities of the future, he was certain of one thing, and that was that the cultivator in front of him might be the most powerful and unfathomable cultivator among the 9 cultivators he couldn't determine. It was difficult to appear extraordinary, but it was even more difficult for an extraordinary existence to appear ordinary. Obviously, the other 8 cultivators were only at the level that seemed extraordinary. As for the final cultivator, he had already surpassed this level and reached a level that seemed quite ordinary. Although even the level of a 6 tribulations expert he showed was absolutely not ordinary in absolute terms, in the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road, his performance was the most extraordinary. At this moment, an inexplicable feeling of being watched suddenly appeared in the heart of this incarnation of Luo Fan. It was as if some existence was looking down from an unimaginable height and covering him with its eyes. Feeling this feeling of being watched, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. "Who is it?" His expression froze, and he began to use all kinds of methods to find out the source of this peeping gaze. Naturally, he had borrowed the power of the split Tao fruit. At this time, for him, the most powerful and most mysterious method was obviously the division Tao fruit, which already had a part of the characteristics of a true divine. It could be said that among all the methods, divine sense, and various wonderful methods he had mastered, there was only one that could detect the existence of the peeping gaze, and it must be the division Tao fruit. With this understanding, of course, he would focus on the division Tao fruit. Of course, the focus was only the focus. After all, the focus was not everything. Therefore, even if the greatest hope was pinned on the division Tao fruit, Luo Fan's incarnation did not stop working hard. He also used all kinds of abilities, divine sense, various wonderful methods, and even all kinds of mysterious methods derived from the world of laws to find out the source of the peeping gaze. Unfortunately, even so, in the end, it was difficult for him to find out where the peeping gaze was coming from. On the contrary, because of the various methods he used, the peeping gaze seemed to have become even more intense. It was as if his various probing methods had already attracted the attention of the spy, causing the spy to be even more interested in him. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan's expression became inexplicably ugly. For him, this was simply the most direct insult. At this moment, he felt like a monkey performing in a cage. The more he struggled, the more he tried to find ways to escape this cage, but he discovered that the audience watching him outside was getting more and more excited and delighted. However, he was Luo Fan after all, and his temperament cultivation had already reached an unimaginable level. It didn't take long for him to suppress all the distracting thoughts in his mind. He began to wholeheartedly search for the source of the peeping gaze. Unfortunately, even if he could see countless possibilities in the future, even if he could trace back to the past and change the past at will, even if he could replace the present at will, in the end, he still could not find out where the peeping gaze came from. Only the feeling of following him like a shadow told him that the gaze itself existed. It told him that some kind of existence that he could not reach was looking at him from an unimaginable height. It's him. Although he could not find any traces or evidence, Luo Fan finally instinctively determined the source of the peeping gaze. The source was none other than the one he was paying attention to just now, the most unfathomable cultivator among the 9 that he could not see through. He's definitely not an ordinary 8th tribulation powerhouse. Moreover, it's very likely that he's a 9th tribulation powerhouse. At this moment, Luo Fan came to this realization. When did this feeling of being peeped come from? It came from the moment he focused his attention on that cultivator. Although this couldn't prove anything, it was enough for people to link the two together. At this time, that existence didn't seem to be unusual at all. He behaved the same as before, completely looking like an ordinary 6th tribulation powerhouse. However, Luo Fan felt that some kind of indescribable change seemed to have happened to his body. It was even a change that was difficult to truly distinguish. At that moment, a subtle smile suddenly appeared on the cultivator's face. A smile that had nothing to do with what he was doing, and had nothing to do with anyone else that he was currently facing. It could even be called a strange smile. For the cultivator that was currently communicating with him, this smile actually wasn't that special. After all, not every expression and every word of a normal living being in the process of communicating with others was meaningful. Some of them might have been born out of a feeling and appeared because of a moment of distracting thoughts. Even if one had reached the 6th tribulation powerhouse level, this kind of phenomenon was unavoidable. After all, most cultivators couldn't be in that state of cultivation all the time. In other words, it was impossible for them to suppress their distracting thoughts all the time. With distracting thoughts, there would naturally be some meaningless words and meaningless expressions. At this moment, that cultivator's smile didn't look much different from the smiles caused by those distracting thoughts. Unless it was someone like Luo Fan who was constantly paying attention, how could other cultivators have too many feelings for him? However, when such a smile fell into Luo Fan's eyes, it was like a bolt of lightning that instantly made him tremble slightly. As expected, he noticed me. It really is him spying on me. At this moment, a thought appeared in his mind like a flash of lightning. At this moment, he no longer concealed himself and focused his gaze on the 6th tribulation powerhouse in front of him. Or rather, he focused on the 7th, 8th, or 9th tribulation cultivator in front of him. It was very likely that the other party was spying on him, so what he did was naturally no secret to the other party. Once there were no secrets to speak of, no matter how he tried to conceal himself, it would just be like a clown's performance. What was the point? Because of this, he didn't conceal his gaze at the cultivator in front of him at all. The cultivator was spying on him, and he was spying on the other party. In this way, the situation looked like it was about to reach a stalemate. However, this was obviously just a forceful balance. At this moment, Luo Fan's spying on him was only on the surface. He couldn't even see much about the other party that was extraordinary. On the other hand, the other party could see all of Luo Fan's secrets, methods, and even some of Luo Fan's thoughts clearly. There was clearly a difference in the spying power. Therefore, even though it seemed like they were evenly matched and no one was winning, Luo Fan obviously didn't think so. He was spying on the cultivator without concealment, but he was telling the other party that he had discovered that the spying on him was coming from him. As for whether it was correct or not, it would depend on the cultivator's reaction. In other words, it would depend on whether the cultivator cooperated or not. In the end, he couldn't see through his various secrets like the gaze that was spying on him. He could only guess what was going on inside through what was on the surface. At this moment, the cultivator stopped what he was doing and turned his head to look at the void. Of course, this was only what the sixth tribulation powerhouses in the vicinity felt. In Luo Fan's eyes, the position that the cultivator was looking at was exactly where he was. At this moment, her gaze seemed to have crossed countless barriers and directly made contact with his gaze. It really is you. At this moment, Luo Fan couldn't help but let out a sigh. Although he had many guesses before, they were all just guesses before this. There was no evidence to prove that his guesses were correct. And now, with the gaze of the cultivator, the evidence that he wanted had obviously arrived. That's right, it's me. At this moment, the cultivator spoke. The voice directly penetrated countless obstacles and appeared in Luo Fan's ears. It was as if a sudden clap of thunder had appeared in his ears. Did I just speak? At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly began to doubt whether he had spoken the words that he had in mind before. Chapter 32:12. Of course, this doubt only flashed across Luo Fan's mind for a split second. He was not an ordinary person after all. His control over his body had already reached an unimaginable depth. With this kind of control ability, it was impossible for him to be in a situation where he could not help but say it out loud even though he was thinking it in his heart. Luo Fan had absolute confidence in this. The reason why he had doubts just now was because the development of the situation was too subversive and unbelievable. It was the result of that momentary shock to his heart. Because of this, he was able to dispel his doubts in an instant. However, after dispelling this doubt, his mood became even more solemn. If he did not say it out loud, but the other party knew what he was thinking just now, wouldn't that mean that the cultivator had seen through his thoughts in that instant? Compared to the fact that he couldn't control himself from speaking his mind, this was even more unacceptable to him. The ability to see through other cultivators' thoughts was not unfamiliar to Luo Fan. However, before this ability had mostly appeared on him. In other words, he had seen through the thoughts of other living beings. His thoughts had been seen through by others. He had never experienced such a thing before. At the very least, he had never experienced it in his mind, but now this was the first time he had experienced the treatment of having his thoughts seen through by others. This feeling was obviously extremely unpleasant for him. It was a terrible feeling, as if everything about him was being offended, and his most secretive secrets were being exposed. The difference in realms needs to be at a certain level for one to be able to read thoughts at will. Has the difference in realms really reached such a level? Suddenly, this thought emerged in Luo Fan's mind. There was actually no fixed standard for reading the memories of other living beings. It did not say how much of a difference in realms was needed for one to be able to do it. Moreover, it did not mean that one would be able to do it just because of the difference in realms. In reality, there were many factors that affected whether one could do it or not. Not only did it require a huge difference in realms, but it also required the support of various special qualities. If certain factors were missing, it wouldn't be possible no matter how great the gap in their cultivation realms was. In the past, the reason why Luo Fan could read the thoughts of some cultivators at will was because his cultivation base was much higher than that of the cultivator, and he had all sorts of characteristics that supported his reading ability. However, even so, it was difficult for him to casually read the thoughts of those cultivators who were not too far away from him. And this difference in realm was not even the same realm. A seventh tribulation expert. Instead, it was extremely difficult for him to see through even a sixth tribulation expert's thoughts. Even if he could occasionally see through a little, it was only on the surface. He was unable to reach the depths. As he thought of this, he suddenly calmed down. He was like that to those sixth tribulation cultivators. Now, this cultivator who might be a ninth tribulation cultivator might also be like that to him. The only reason why he was able to see through her thoughts just now was because her thoughts were too intense. And this was also in line with what he sensed. If his thoughts were really read by someone else, the feeling of being offended would definitely be thousands or even tens of thousands of times more intense than it was now. This was the instinctive feeling of a living being. But now, he didn't have that kind of feeling. Therefore, his thoughts being peeped at and his thoughts being read was only on the surface at most. His true secret thoughts, his secret thoughts, were still his secrets. Thinking of this, he gradually relaxed. As he relaxed, the thing that made him lose his composure due to the sudden impact and was difficult to see through truly appeared before his eyes. If he can really peep into all my thoughts and thoughts, then there's no need for him to peep into me like this. This thought flashed through his mind, making him even more certain of his judgment. If he could really peep into all thoughts and thoughts, then all of his secrets would no longer be secrets to him. All of his cultivation, all of his principles, everything he did before and his current state, to him, were just like the lines on his palm. If that was the case, why would that cultivator need to spend so much effort to peep into him from an extremely high angle? He would have long taken away everything that he was interested in. Since he was still peeping into him like this, even if that peeping method was so amazing, so advanced, and brought him so much pressure. But peeping was peeping. Since it was peeping, it proved that this peeping was still necessary. It also proved that he still hadn't grasped everything about him. Understanding this, his mind became more and more at ease. I was almost scared by you, fellow Taoist. Luo Fan sighed and said. The cultivator smiled and said, You weren't almost scared just now, you were really scared, right? As he spoke, a figure appeared in front of Luo Fan, who was in the fruit-splitting division. However, this figure was faintly discernible. One could recognize that it was the figure of that cultivator, but it couldn't really become clear, nor could it really become stable. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan felt even more relaxed. This represented a fact, and that was that the fruit-splitting division was obviously not something that the cultivator could come and go as he pleased. Even if it was a nine-tribulation powerhouse, it really is the legendary fruit of Tao. At this moment, the figure of the cultivator sighed. There was an inexplicable desire in his eyes, as well as an indescribable sense of disbelief. Even though he had already guessed this possibility, he still felt that it was unbelievable when he confirmed that the endless world in front of him had actually formed a fruit of Tao. The cultivator in front of him was indeed a nine-tribulation powerhouse. Moreover, he wasn't an ordinary nine-tribulation powerhouse, but an absolute powerhouse among nine-tribulation powerhouses. His strength was above most nine-tribulation powerhouses. Although he was still extremely far from being a true sage, it was naturally a bit exaggerated to say that he had grasped some of the mysteries of a true sage. However, standing at such a high level, he obviously had a deeper understanding of a true sage than other cultivators. Obviously, the fruit of Tao was within the scope of his understanding. It seems that even in the ninth level, the the fruit of Tao is very rare. Luo Fan smiled faintly at this time. At this moment, although the cultivator here seemed to be just a phantom, and the one in the 6th level of the Tao Master's path was the real one, but the reality was the opposite. In other words, in fact, the phantom here was the real body. On the contrary, the real body in the 6th level of the Tao Master's path was the projection. You'll only know what the 9th level is like when you really go there. Although it seems that you have a great chance to step into it now, you haven't yet. The phantom of the cultivator looked at Luo Fan at this time. His expression was quite calm. He obviously already knew that the intention of Luo Fan's words was to test what realm he was in. However, he didn't care about this at all, nor did he have the idea of hiding his realm. He directly said it without any disguise. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan's eyes were filled with a hint of understanding, and at the same time, he was even more relieved. His sudden realization was naturally because the words of the cultivator in front of him confirmed his guess, that the other party was indeed a 9-tribulation powerhouse. And the relief he brought was naturally not because the other party's attitude towards him was so calm. It was because, after confirming that the other party was a 9-tribulation powerhouse, he knew that in the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, the other party absolutely could not do whatever he wanted. It was already quite a difficult thing to go against the flow of one level. The higher the level, the more difficult it was to achieve this. That was to say, from the 2nd level of the Tao Master's path to the 1st level, it was already quite a difficult thing. And from the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path to the 2nd level, it was 10 times or even more difficult than from the 2nd level to the 1st level. In this way, the difficulty of going back to the 6th level of the Tao Master's path to the 7th level was obviously far greater than the difficulty of going back to the 1st level from the 2nd level, and the difficulty of going against the flow of 2 levels was hundreds or even thousands of times more difficult than going against the flow of 1 level. It was precisely because of this that the number of 7 tribulation powerhouses on the 6th level of the Tao Master's path was actually not small. After all, although the difficulty of going against the flow of 1 level had already reached an unimaginable level at this level, among the countless 7 tribulation powerhouses, there was still a group of them who could do it. And among the group of 7 tribulation powerhouses who could do it, even if there were not many who were interested in doing it, the total number seemed to be quite large. Compared to the number of 7 tribulation powerhouses, the number of 8 tribulation powerhouses was innumerable times less. At this moment, according to Luo Fan's guess, among the unknown hundreds of millions of 6 tribulation powerhouses, only the 8 cultivators who had caught his attention previously were truly 8 tribulation powerhouses. And if even 8 tribulation powerhouses wanted to return to the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, the difficulty of a 9 tribulation powerhouse wanting to go against the flow of 3 levels to return to the 6th level of the Tao Master's path would obviously be even more heaven-defying. Therefore, the 9 tribulation powerhouse before him could appear on the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. It was easy to imagine the level of his strength. Just this point alone was enough to confirm that his strength was definitely near the peak among the 9 tribulations experts. Only by doing so would he be able to do this and appear before Luo Fan. And according to the rules of the Tao Master's path, going against the flow of 1 level was already a violation of the rules. Once discovered by the power of the Tao Master's prison, he would definitely be punished. And to go against the flow of 2 levels, in the eyes of the Tao Master's prison, was obviously a greater crime. In other words, if discovered by the power of the Tao Master's prison, a 7 tribulation powerhouse who went against the flow of 1 level to the 6th level of the Tao Master's path would still have a chance of survival, and might just be sealed. Then, an 8 tribulation powerhouse who went against the flow of 3 levels to the 6th level of the Tao Master's path would most likely lose half of his life, and in the end, suffer injuries that he might not be able to recover from even after countless years. Based on this development, if a 9 tribulation powerhouse who went against the flow of 3 levels to the 6th level of the Tao Master's path was discovered by the power of the Tao Master's prison, then the punishment that he would suffer would definitely be stronger than that of an 8 tribulation powerhouse. Of course, if this 9 tribulation powerhouse could resist the power of the Tao Master's prison, then there was no need to say anything more. If he could really resist the power of the punishment, then the punishment would naturally be completely meaningless, and there would be no need to see how strong the punishment would be. What was even more obvious was that such a thing would never happen. No matter how strong this 9 tribulation powerhouse was, even if he was so strong that he could go against the flow of 3 levels of the Tao Master's path back to the 6th level, it could not change the fact. That was, he still had to rely on the Tao Master's path to cultivate, and he still had to rely on the conditions created by the Tao Master's path to improve himself, and this obviously meant that the level of the Tao Master's path was definitely higher than that of a 9 tribulation powerhouse. And how could the power of the punishment set by an existence that was higher than the 9 tribulation powerhouse be weaker than the 9 tribulation powerhouse? And how could it be possible that the 9 tribulation powerhouse could resist it? Therefore, it was obvious that even if the 9 tribulation powerhouse was so strong that he could go against the natural order in Luo Fan's eyes, compared to the power of the Tao Master's prison, he was still weak. To him, the Tao Master's prison was still an existence that he needed to avoid. And in this case, for Luo Fan, an opportunity had obviously appeared. He did not need to have the power to resist the 9 tribulation powerhouse. He only needed to have the power to force the 9 tribulation powerhouse to use the power that could alarm the Tao Master's prison, and that would be enough to make the 9 tribulation powerhouse hesitate to attack him. And obviously, even if Luo Fan did not have this level of power, he had the fruit of Division Tao. With the fruit of Division Tao, he might still have countless weaknesses against the 9 tribulation powerhouse, but he finally had the means to truly threaten the 9 tribulation powerhouse. And if he wanted to resist such means, it was obviously impossible to conceal himself like now, and completely not touch the power of the Tao Master's prison. Regarding this point, Luo Fan had already thought it through very quickly. And it was precisely because of this that he felt more at ease at this time. Chapter 32:13. As Luo Fan faced the 9 tribulations expert in front of him with more confidence, he felt that the expert in front of him was no longer as unfathomable as before. There were already faint traces of inexplicable traces on his body. These traces were faintly discernible, clear and blurry at the same time, but they still existed in the end. Compared to before, there was still a fundamental difference. I see, what you're here is actually just a projection. At this moment, he looked at the shadow in front of him and said. Previously, he only felt that the 9 tribulations expert in front of him was extremely mysterious. The incarnation was like a projection, but the projection was like the real body. But now, after seeing some traces of power and strength, he realized that his first feeling was actually correct. A projection was a projection. It wasn't because the manifestation of power was special that it appeared this way, but because its essence was indeed this way. As for why this was so, the reason was actually very obvious. Because this was the fruit of formation. Because here, Luo Fan was already standing at an unimaginable height, and vaguely, he already had traces of the characteristics of a true sage. Under such circumstances, anything that stepped into this place would definitely have to reveal its true appearance. It would have to reveal its true characteristics. Even if Luo Fan himself didn't realize it, it would still be the case. It could be said that all of this happened outside of Luo Fan's consciousness, in a place that he couldn't sense and didn't know. Only then could it become like this. Before Luo Fan could feel it, the essence of the 9 tribulations expert was already directly revealed in front of him. The 9 tribulations expert's projection heard Luo Fan's words and sighed. Indeed, it's not that easy to hide the existence of those who have formed the fruit of formation. He sighed. At this moment, he looked at Luo Fan as if he was looking at a huge group of animals. There was an indescribable complexity in his eyes, as if he had already suffered a great loss at the hands of this huge group of animals. It's very difficult to hide the existence of those who have formed the fruit of formation. Does that mean that you've already seen many existences who have formed the fruit of formation? Could it be that forming a Tao fruit is a very common thing on the 9th level? Luo Fan asked directly. At this moment, he was too lazy to continue guessing in his heart. After all, since he said that, it was obvious that he already had the intention to tell the truth. At the very least, that was the part of the truth that he revealed. Furthermore, the other party seemed to have some sort of ability to see through his thoughts. Under such circumstances, rather than guessing in secret, it was better to ask directly. Of course, although not everyone on the 9th level can form a Tao fruit, it's not something that everyone can do. After all, different cultivators took different cultivation paths. Some cultivators already had the ability to form Tao fruits, but they chose not to do so. However, since they had this ability, there would naturally be many who chose to form their Tao fruits in the end. Therefore, things like Tao fruits are rather common in the 9th level, the 9 tribulation expert said indifferently. Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned and said, "I feel that you are lying." He did not have any real evidence to prove his feeling. It was just a faintly discernible feeling that told him that the other party might be lying. However, at this moment, after the splitting of the Tao fruit, the essence of the 9 tribulation expert was directly revealed, and everything about the other party was clearly revealed. Luo Fan already had a lot more trust in the splitting of the Tao fruit. Since he had such a feeling at this time, it clearly showed that the other party was very likely to be lying. Only in this way could he have such a feeling at this time. Hearing his words, the 9 tribulation expert did not deny it, nor did he admit it. He only smiled and said, "Whether I am lying or not, it is up to you to judge for yourself. In short, my answer is here." Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and he was even more certain that the other party was lying. From the fact that the 9 tribulation expert could recognize the Tao fruit, it was obvious that the Tao fruit definitely existed in the 9th level of the Tao Master's path. If it did not exist, even if the other party knew about the existence of the Tao fruit from the true divine, it would not be possible for him to recognize the splitting of the Tao fruit so easily, let alone come here at this time, directly invade his Tao fruit, and appear in front of him. However, similarly, from the fact that the other party was interested in invading his Tao fruit, and was actually interested in appearing in front of him, it could be seen that the Tao fruit was not something common in the 9th level of the Tao Master's path. Moreover, it was very likely to be extremely precious. Faced with such a situation, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face, and an indescribable joy appeared in his eyes. He said, "I see. It seems that you have suffered at the hands of the Tao fruit before." His words naturally did not cause any change in the 9 tribulation expert's expression. However, Luo Fan could faintly feel that the emotions of the 9 tribulations powerhouse in front of him fluctuated subtly because of his words. This let him know that he had guessed correctly once again. "Thank you very much, fellow Taoist. If it were not for your existence, I'm afraid it would have taken me a very long time to discover the many wonderful uses of the Tao fruit." Feeling all kinds of subtle feelings, Luo Fan suddenly expressed his feelings. The 9 tribulation expert in front of him brought him a great deal of pressure. This kind of pressure was so terrifying that it even forced him to dig deep into the potential of the Tao fruit. Subsequently, at this time, he discovered many kinds of wonderful uses belonging to the Tao fruit that he had not discovered before. And perhaps he could also discover these wonderful uses in the future, and similarly have the opportunity to discover them, but it would definitely take a very long time to be able to do so. But now, he had achieved this by spending only a little bit of time. It could be said that this had already saved him a lot of time, so that he could have the opportunity to use this energy and time in other aspects. This, for him, was obviously very important. After all, compared to those cultivators who walked the right path, the path that Luo Fan walked, the wrong path, had a sharp blade hanging over his head, constantly forcing him. If he delayed for even a moment, the sharp blade would come crashing down and directly pierce through him. That sharp blade was naturally the Great Tribulation, although, after communicating with the Tao Master's disciples, he confirmed that this Great Tribulation was the focus of cultivation for those who walked the wrong path. It was where the opportunities were. But a Great Tribulation was a Great Tribulation, no matter how important it was, no matter how many opportunities there were. It could not change the fact that it was a Great Tribulation in essence. And since it was a Great Tribulation, it was naturally a test. Naturally there would be danger, and naturally there would be countless possibilities for it to disappear, for it to be completely subverted. Under such circumstances, the Great Tribulation that could descend at any time was equivalent to danger that could descend at any time, equivalent to the possibility of its destruction at any time. Therefore, to him, being able to save a little time meant that he would have more time to deal with the Great Tribulation and prepare for it. This was naturally very important to him. Of course, if it was in other aspects, although he felt that he had made a profit, he would not directly say it to this Nine Tribulations powerhouse at this time. After all, there were too many ways to save time. Even if he casually looked, he could easily find thousands of ways to increase his efficiency and ultimately achieve the effect of saving time. If it was just ordinary time saving, Luo Fan would at most feel that he had made a profit, but his heart would not be too moved because of this, and he would not directly say these words in front of this Nine Tribulations powerhouse. The reason why he did this at this time was very simple, because at this time, he could save a lot of time. And it was very important. The longer one was in contact with the fruit of division, the more one could feel the profoundness of the fruit of division. And the more he felt the fruit of division, the more he could naturally have a deeper understanding of the true sage, the higher level of power, and the higher level of the realm. And a deeper understanding, to him, was equivalent to guiding the direction of his cultivation. If he had not come into contact with this Nine Tribulations powerhouse, and had not felt the various potentials of the fruit of division from this Nine Tribulations powerhouse, and had not felt the various subtle uses of the fruit of division, he was afraid that he would need to spend a lot of time to comprehend this point. And this amount of time didn't just represent this amount of time spent. It also represented the lack of direction. It represented the errors in his understanding, and these deficiencies, these errors, would need to spend a lot of time to reverse them. In this way, this amount of time represented not just a little bit of time, but 10 times, 100 times, or even 1,000 times, 10,000 times more time than before. After all, the lack of direction had a huge impact on the efficiency of his self-improvement. To achieve the same level of improvement under the situation of the lack of direction, the amount of time and energy needed would not be comparable to before. At this moment, the Nine Tribulations powerhouse obviously understood what Luo Fan meant. Looking at Luo Fan, his expression did not change at all, but his emotions were fluctuating. However, what surprised Luo Fan was that even so, he actually did not leave this place. He still stayed in front of Luo Fan, as if he was waiting for him to criticize and study. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan understood in his heart. Being in the fruit of division, for this Nine Tribulations powerhouse in front of him, had considerable benefits. This kind of benefit could not be obtained anywhere else. Moreover, it was also extremely beneficial to him, and in other places, it was very difficult to use other methods to make up for it. Only in this way could he bear to be studied and stimulated by Luo Fan in this fruit of division. Even if this was rather embarrassing, he could not see the slightest bit of the demeanor and status of a nine tribulations powerhouse. It was the same. However, as long as one thought about it carefully, this was also reasonable. In the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, this nine tribulations powerhouse was naturally unique, and he was above everything else, even the existence of the fruit of division. In this way, naturally, he had an absolute status. Under this status, it seemed that he needed to maintain his demeanor, and he needed to show that he was a peerless powerhouse. However, in reality, what was the situation in the ninth level of the Tao Master's path? In the ninth level of the Tao Master's path, the number of nine tribulations powerhouses, even if it was not counted in the trillions, must be counted in the trillions. After all, through his previous understanding, he already knew that the number of cultivators in each level of the Tao Master's path was actually about the same. This could be regarded as a certain fundamental rule of the Tao Master's path. According to this rule, the number of cultivators in the ninth level of the Tao Master's path should be about the same as the number of cultivators in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. And if this was really the case, then the number of cultivators in the ninth level of the Tao Master's path would naturally be counted in the trillions. However, although this was the case in theory, Luo Fan still had a longing for and a high opinion of nine tribulations powerhouses. In the end, he was still unwilling to admit that nine tribulations powerhouses were the same as other 8 tribulations, 7 tribulations, 6 tribulations, and even lower-level cultivators. Therefore, he made a discount on this number, thinking that it would not really be counted in the trillions. However, even if he made a discount, it was still not a problem to calculate it in the trillions. After all, this was the Tao Master's path. The rules here were set by the true divine. Even if the achievements of nine tribulations powerhouses were much more difficult than those of the other levels, it was impossible to really go against the fundamental rules too much. There was no way to calculate it in the trillions, but it was still necessary to calculate it in the trillions. And obviously, whether it was in the trillions or the trillions, there was not much difference to the nine tribulations powerhouse lesso. Even to the true pinnacle of the nine tribulations powerhouses, they were definitely not the only ones. In the boundless ninth level of the Tao Master's path, there was bound to be a large number of cultivators who could match or even surpass him. In this way, how could this cultivator develop such a strong sense of pride? How could he give up the true benefits for the sake of a demeanor he did not have, for the sake of a status he did not have? Obviously, it was not good to be studied and explored by Luo Fan in the Tao Fruit Division. It was like turning this nine tribulations powerhouse into a test subject, which greatly hurt his self-esteem. However, in contrast to this kind of treatment, he could explore what he wanted to explore during this process. He could explore the various mysteries of the fruit of the way. The mysteries that he had never come into contact with before would be of great help to his cultivation, and would even be of great help to him in becoming a true saint in the end. Was there a need to say what he should choose? Precisely because of this, at this time, even though he was very unhappy with being studied by Luo Fan in this way, he still turned a blind eye to it, as if he did not feel this displeasure at all. Chapter 32:14. After understanding the mentality of this nine tribulations expert, Luo Fan naturally wouldn't let go of this opportunity. Before meeting this person in front of him, he had only heard of the existence of a nine tribulations expert in legends, but he had never seen one before. What mysteries and mysteries did such an existence have? He could only understand a thing or two by guessing. Under such circumstances, a living nine tribulations expert appeared in front of him, and even allowed him to probe, observe, and spy on him. How attractive was this to him? Therefore, at this moment, even if the attitude of this nine tribulations expert in front of him didn't satisfy him, and there was a faint sense of disdain, he didn't care too much. At that moment, Luo Fan began to use this fruit of division to deeply analyze everything about this nine tribulations expert in front of him. He wanted to figure out all the secrets of this nine tribulations expert. If it were anywhere else, this kind of analysis would naturally be impossible. After all, this was a nine tribulations expert, an existence that was 2 realms stronger than Luo Fan. For a tribulation expert's level, not to mention a difference of 2 realms, even a difference of 1 realm was already considered a world of difference. In this way, in other places, when facing this nine tribulations expert in front of him, all Luo Fan could do was run as far away as possible. Even if he didn't even have the ability to run, he would be directly killed by him. Even if that nine tribulations expert didn't make a decision to be hostile and allowed him to explore and analyze, the final result would definitely be that Luo Fan's hard work for a long time would be to no avail. He couldn't see through the nine tribulations expert at all, and he didn't even know what unimaginable characteristics he had. But, obviously, this was only the situation in other places. In this fruit of division, the situation was naturally completely different. This fruit of division's profoundness had already been explained too much before. Here, even the essence of that nine tribulations expert was directly reflected. Even before Luo Fan could react, the essence that he couldn't imagine was completely presented in front of him. How could such an existence be the same as ordinary places? With the stimulation of that nine tribulations expert, at this moment, Luo Fan's understanding of fruit of division had already become much deeper, and he could already faintly mobilize some of the power of fruit of division that he couldn't mobilize before. Just like at this moment, when he wanted to dissect the nine tribulations expert, he suddenly felt that the nine tribulations expert's body began to gradually fade in his eyes, and some kind of indescribable true appearance began to gradually reveal itself. In just an instant, the projection before him abruptly shed the appearance of a shadow and transformed into boundless space, time, world, heaven and earth, divine abilities, might, talisman markings, laws, and so on and so forth. Everything that Luo Fan could imagine and everything that he couldn't imagine was profound and mysterious. Along with this change, an unimaginable amount of information burst out from his body crazily, and Qi of Sea Tribulations, as Luo of Qi Bulation's realm, Luo Fan. The amount of information was so huge that it could be said to be endless. At this moment, although this information had just burst out, Luo Fan already felt an indescribable pressure acting on his mind through this information. Amidst this information, he felt as if his entire mind was about to collapse, and his entire mind was about to be shattered into countless pieces. Every inch of this nine tribulations expert's projection seemed to contain endless mysteries. Looking at him, it was as if looking at the endless universe. At this moment, that nine tribulations expert seemed to sense something, and his body trembled slightly. In an instant, Luo Fan felt the power of fruit of division suddenly stagnate. The feeling that the figure in front of him had turned into the endless universe suddenly disappeared. The figure in front of him returned to the appearance of a shadow. Faced with such a change, Luo Fan frowned slightly. "You seem to have changed your mind?" he said plainly. Hearing this, that nine tribulations expert sighed and said, "The mysteries of fruit of Tao are more mysterious than I imagined. If I let you continue, I'm afraid my true nature will be dissected by you." Obviously, this nine tribulations expert was also feeling rather regretful. This was to be expected. For this nine tribulations expert, the longer he stayed in this fruit of division of Tao, the more rewards he could obtain. Although Luo Fan didn't know what those rewards would be under such circumstances, he had to stop because of some unforeseen circumstances. To him, this was of course regretful. But, obviously, he was still a nine tribulations expert. His rationality was naturally enough to suppress all the negative emotions in his heart. Even though he felt extremely regretful that he had stopped now, he didn't ignore the warning in his heart. He didn't continue because he felt that it wasn't appropriate to continue because of a fluke mentality. So, he directly stopped at this moment. And the method he used at this moment was actually not really to fight against this fruit of division of Tao. Although it looked very similar in fact, the method he used at this time was to separate himself from the fruit of division of Tao. Relying on this separation, he seemed to be in the fruit of division of Tao, but in fact, his true location had already been moved to an infinitely distant place. In other words, at this time, it seemed that he hadn't moved much, but the figure he left in the fruit of division of Tao was no longer the original body on the 6th floor of the path of Tao Master, but had truly turned into a shadow. Although his original body on the 6th floor of the path of Tao Master was only a projection of his original body on the 6th floor of the path of Tao Master, even his body was not here. Naturally, the fruit of division of Tao could no longer be dissected like before. After all, the target of the dissection could not be found. How could it be dissected? Luo Fan secretly sighed. Ruthless information shrank in his heart, and finally turned into a rather intermittent drop of some of the characteristics of a 9 tribulations expert. With the appearance of these characteristics, Luo Fan's eyes flashed and instantly penetrated the infinite distance, through the barriers of time and space, and shone on an ordinary 6 tribulations expert who had appeared out of thin air somewhere on the 6th floor of the path of Tao Master. Everything about this 6 tribulations expert seemed so normal, and there was no difference between him and an ordinary 6 tribulations expert. Even the others around this 6 tribulations expert did not notice that he had not existed before. They only felt that this person had always been by their side, and they were actually very familiar with him and had a very deep friendship with him. It could be said that after a short while, when the sudden appearance of the drips of traces disappeared, he would no longer have any flaws. However, at this time, Luo Fan had cast his gaze from the fruit of division of Tao and directly locked onto him. The seemingly ordinary 6 tribulations expert in front of him was naturally the real body of the 9 tribulations expert on the 6th floor of the path of Tao Master, and also the projection of his original body. The way he appeared here was completely incomprehensible even to Luo Fan, who was already at the peak of the 7 tribulations expert. There were so many mysteries involved, and the profoundness was so profound that even he was confused. However, even though he was confused by all of this, he had already grasped the traces of this 9 tribulation expert through his previous analysis of him. At this time, he directly locked on to his position through the traces, and then directly determined his position in the endless void of the 6th floor of the path of Tao Master, among the huge number of cultivators. It was precisely because of this that he was able to directly lock on to the cultivator in front of him among the endless cultivators. At this time, the cultivator instantly noticed that Luo Fan had locked on to him, and his expression changed slightly. The figure of the 9 tribulations expert in the fruit of division of Tao looked at Luo Fan with an inexplicable look, as if there was a probing look in his eyes. Faintly, Luo Fan even felt that the gaze that was looking down at him from an extremely high place seemed to have become sharper and sharper. The spying on his thoughts also became more and more powerful because of this. It was as if it wanted to dig deeper into the depths of his heart, to dig out the deeper thoughts and secrets at the bottom of his heart. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan knew that his behavior had truly stimulated the 9 tribulations expert. After all, if there was no real stimulation, how could the 9 tribulations expert have such a change in style? For example, if an ordinary person did not receive some kind of stimulation, how could his attitude towards someone suddenly change so drastically? With regards to such a change, Luo Fan was actually more than happy to see it happen. Although this would put more pressure on him, at least it showed that he had caused enough stimulation to the 9 tribulations expert. In the past, although the pressure from the 9 tribulations expert was relatively small. However, under this small pressure, the 9 tribulations expert looked down on him, and did not care about him at all. This was obviously a great form of contempt, and a great harm to his self-esteem. This also meant that the distance between him and the Nine Tribulations expert was so large that there was no need for the Nine Tribulations expert to take him seriously. And now, although his strength did not increase substantially, he had clearly grasped some traces that belonged to the Nine Tribulations expert. Through these traces, he could truly pose a threat to the Nine Tribulations expert. This was obviously a huge improvement compared to before. An improvement was naturally something to be happy about. In the face of this stronger prying on his thoughts, Luo Fan's expression was rather solemn. The connection between his spirit and the split fruit of Tao became closer and closer. Faintly, he could feel some kind of indescribable power starting to spread to his body from the split fruit of Tao, gradually protecting him. Along with this change, the prying into his thoughts began to gradually disappear. In the end, it completely disappeared without a trace, as if it had never been there. It works indeed. As this feeling of prying disappeared, an indescribable joy arose in Luo Fan's heart. This was his first attempt to use the power of the split fruit of Tao to block the prying on his spirit. Whether it would ultimately succeed, he could not be sure before the results were out. Under such circumstances, the success of this attempt was naturally something to be happy about. As for why he thought of this and why he could do this, it was naturally because the stimulation from the Nine Tribulations expert had given him a deeper understanding of the split fruit of Tao. Because his understanding had deepened, his use of the split fruit of Tao had naturally become more subtle. With this kind of meticulous use, he was naturally able to make the power within the Tao fruit undergo the transformation that he wanted, a transformation that had never existed before. The final result was that he was able to use this power to protect his spirit, to protect his thoughts, so that his spirit and his thoughts would not be spied on by experts of a higher level. At this moment, the Nine Tribulations expert's expression changed slightly. At the same time, the seemingly ordinary Six Tribulations expert, whose position had been locked on by Luo Fan, shook slightly and disappeared without a trace. When he reappeared, he was already in another seemingly ordinary position. However, as his position changed, Luo Fan's perception locked onto him like a shadow and locked on to his position once again. With this change, the Nine Tribulations expert finally confirmed that what he had just felt wasn't an illusion. At this moment, he let out a sigh. In a flash, he appeared outside of the Tao Fruit division. That's right, he didn't appear outside the branch of the island in any layer of the void ocean. Instead, he appeared outside the island above the entire void ocean. In other words, he appeared outside the complete split fruit of Tao. After he appeared here, the shadow in front of Luo Fan in the split fruit of Tao also began to gradually fade. In a short while, it disappeared without a trace, as if it had never been there. Sure enough, I can't excessively stimulate the existence of the split fruit of Tao. At this time, the person who appeared outside was a young cultivator. He still looked very ordinary. In fact, he looked even more ordinary than any of the cultivators he had transformed into before. Previously, he was only ordinary in the sixth layer of the path of Tao Master. In other words, he was an ordinary Six Tribulations expert. But at this moment it was truly ordinary. There was nothing special about it, nothing extraordinary about it. After all, the ordinary people in the sixth layer of the path of Tao Master were all Six Tribulations expert. But were Six Tribulations experts ordinary? They were terrifying existences that could easily destroy heaven and earth, easily open up countless worlds, and even countless worlds. Such an existence, if judged by absolute standards, could not be considered ordinary no matter how one looked at it. Chapter 32:15. Before this, the Nine Tribulations expert had seemed ordinary in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. In other words, he was extremely unusual by absolute standard. After all, no ordinary existence had ever been able to create a world at will, or even a heaven and earth, but now, the Nine Tribulations expert was completely different. Now, his ordinary nature was no longer just ordinary in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. Instead, he had become extremely ordinary from an absolute point of view. In this state, he was truly just an ordinary being, and there was no longer any extraordinary qualities about him. However, it was obvious that the appearance of such an unusual thing here was already the most unusual thing in the world. After all, what was this place? This was the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. Moreover, the place where he appeared at this time was not the place where ordinary creatures might appear on the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, such as the world, heaven and earth, or space-time created by a six tribulations expert. Instead, he appeared directly on the entire body of the Nothingness Sea, near Luo Fan's Fruit of the Way. In this place, except for those six tribulations experts who could exist here by relying on their own heavens because of the rules of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, even the incarnations of those six tribulations experts could not really appear here. Even Luo Fan had to rely on the magical effect of the Fruit of the Way to make his incarnation appear here. From this, it could be seen how difficult it was to appear here. But, at this time, such an ordinary creature, without any extraordinary or special features, directly appeared here, standing side by side with the Fruit of the Way, and with the heavens of the countless six tribulations experts on the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. No matter from which perspective, this obviously had nothing to do with the ordinary. It could be said that the ordinary appearance of this nine tribulations expert at this time was the most unusual thing about his appearance. Looking at this nine tribulations expert, who was using this ordinary way to show his greatest abnormality, Luo Fan secretly sighed. Because he already knew that this nine tribulations expert no longer had the intention to continue communicating with him. Next, even the best development was that the nine tribulations expert would ignore him and continue to carry out his original plans on the sixth level of the Tao Master's road in such an ordinary way. And if the development situation was a little worse, then he might have another enemy at the level of a nine tribulation expert. Thinking of this possibility, even Luo Fan couldn't help but feel nervous. After all, this was a nine tribulations expert. Even if he had many scruples in the sixth level of the Tao Sovereign Path, he might not be able to unleash his true strength. But he was a nine tribulations expert after all. The methods and divine powers that he possessed were not things that Luo Fan could understand. This confusion was the source of his nervousness. After all, who knew how much power a ninth tribulation expert could unleash under these many misgivings? Perhaps, as Luo Fan guessed, he was not much of a threat to him at all. Or perhaps, he possessed an ability that far exceeded his imagination. Even under such restrictions, he could still easily suppress him. That was something that could not be said for certain. With such worries, how could Luo Fan not feel nervous? However, of course, after all, he knew that the other party had scruples. So even if he was nervous, it was not too serious. "What's your next plan?" At this time, Luo Fan said faintly. For existences at their level, some nonsense was actually no longer necessary. If one party was interested, they could naturally talk about the nonsense that both parties were aware of. But if both parties were not interested, the nonsense could naturally be skipped. At this time, it was obvious that both Luo Fan and the nine tribulations expert were no longer in the mood to talk nonsense. Hearing this, the nine tribulations expert, who was also a young cultivator, had a rather regretful expression on his face. He said, "I originally planned to cultivate on this floor for a period of time, but I didn't expect that although there was an unexpected gain this time, it also ruined my plans. So, I should be leaving this level next." "I see. Then, should I say bon voyage now?" Luo Fan's expression did not change much as he said so. "Don't worry, I have no intention of attacking you. No matter what, you are just an incarnation. Even if I get rid of you, it will only cause you to lose an incarnation. It will not affect your essence much. Instead, it will only make the hatred between us irreconcilable. How can I do something like this where the losses outweigh the gains? The Nine Tribulations expert only said. Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned slightly. He knew that he was an incarnation. This was naturally not surprising to him. However, what puzzled him was that since the Nine Tribulations expert was unwilling to attack him because he was an incarnation, then why didn't he directly attack his real body? The relationship between his incarnation and his real body might be a secret and a mystery to other Six Tribulations experts, but for this Nine Tribulations expert, it was definitely not a big secret. The other party must have already figured out where his real body was and what he was doing now. Therefore, if he really wanted to, it would be absolutely no problem for him to directly deal with his main body, and his incarnation was protected by the fruit of division, which made the Nine Tribulations expert a little afraid to attack. But his real body did not have such an advantage. It should be known that his real body was currently in his own heavens, and the heavens were possessed by all the Six Tribulations experts on the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road. How could such an existence be able to resist the Nine Tribulations expert? If the Nine Tribulations expert really wanted to, he could break through the barrier of his heavens and infiltrate his own strength, his own divine sense, his own magic art, and even other things related to ideas into his heavens without any difficulty. And once these things infiltrated his heavens, then, with the level of the Nine Tribulations expert, it would be a piece of cake for him to get rid of him. But obviously, the other party did not do so. What was the reason for this? If he could not figure this out, he obviously could not figure out what the Nine Tribulations expert was worried about, and he could not figure out the real restrictions of the Nine Tribulations expert on the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road. Is it the Tao Master's prison? He murmured. Although he did not say it out loud, his thoughts had already locked on to this speculation, and this kind of locking on to this thought made it completely appear on the surface of his mind. And this obviously made this thought no longer secret in the eyes of the existence who could pry into his thoughts. It could almost be regarded as holding a loudspeaker and loudly announcing it. In the face of such a change, the Nine Tribulations expert read this thought in an instant. His expression changed slightly. However, he did not react to this. Even though he already knew that Luo Fan had placed this thought on the surface of his mind to test him, he did not react to it. Although he knew that this kind of inaction had already directly told Luo Fan the answer he wanted to know. Sure enough, just as the Nine Tribulations expert had guessed, at this moment, Luo Fan had already guessed a lot of things. He was sure that this Nine Tribulations expert was either unable to deal with the cultivator's true body in the heavens, or he could, but once he did so, he would have to pay a huge price. This was the only way to make him completely ignore his true body in the heavens, and pretend that it did not exist. And with this train of thought, as long as he thought in this direction, he naturally understood which was more likely. The possibility of him not being able to deal with the cultivator's true body in the heavens was actually quite small. After all, no matter what, he was still a Nine Tribulations expert. And although the origin of the heavens in the 6th level of the Tao Master's path was complicated, and its essence might be extremely high, but no matter what, it was only a product of the 6th level. To say that a Nine Tribulations expert could not deal with this kind of product was simply to deny the meaning of cultivation, and deny the ultimate goal that Luo Fan pursued. After all, if one worked hard and spent billions of trillions of years, went through countless dangers, and eliminated innumerable divergent paths, and finally achieved a realm that was several levels lower than his, and did not need to work hard, spend that time, overcome those dangers, and eliminate those divergent paths, would there be no other way? What was the meaning of this kind of cultivation? Could it be purely for the sake of making it sound good? Therefore, as long as one thought about it, one would know that this possibility was actually quite small. And since this possibility was quite small, it was obvious that the other possibility was higher. And this was obviously also logical. Although the Nine Tribulations expert was extremely powerful, he was ultimately not the most powerful force on the Tao Master's path. In the end, there was still a force that could restrict them on the Tao Master's path. And that force was the Tao Master's prison. If the Nine Tribulations expert attacked the cultivators in the heavens in the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, it would trigger some special reactions from the Tao Master's prison, which would allow the Tao Master's prison to completely lock onto his position. If it was completely confirmed that he had gone against the Tao Master's path to a lower level, then things would obviously make sense. And it made sense, according to this line of reasoning. The heavens that existed in the 6th level of the Tao Master's path originated from the 6 Tribulations expert. But the real reason for their existence was the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. It was the rules of the 6th level of the Tao Master's path that caused the corresponding characteristics of the 6 Tribulations experts to evolve into such a heavens. In other words, these heavens could actually be regarded as an extension of the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. In this way, the 6 Tribulations experts in these heavens could almost be considered to be under the protection of the 6th level of the Tao Master's path at all times. In this way, if a cultivator directly broke through the barrier of the heavens and directly injured the cultivators within, it would obviously be equivalent to directly breaking through the protection of the 6th level of the Tao Master's path and injuring the cultivators within the protection circle. And touching the protection of the 6th level of the Tao Master's path would obviously cause various corresponding changes. Triggering the Tao Master's prison, which was the guardian of the rules, was simply a natural change. Therefore, this second possibility, in terms of logical reasoning, was obviously an extremely logical possibility. Thinking of this, Luo Fan immediately revealed a look of enlightenment on his face. The nervousness in his heart had already been reduced to almost nothing. After confirming that the other party would have to pay an unimaginable price to deal with his main body, he naturally knew that the possibility of the Nine Tribulations expert really attacking him had become very small. Unless Luo Fan deliberately courted death and deliberately angered the Nine Tribulations expert. Otherwise, the Nine Tribulations expert would definitely not be willing to pay such a huge price to deal with him. The Nine Tribulations expert's expression did not change, but he secretly laughed bitterly in his heart. Although I have gained something this time, it's really not a good feeling. Although it seemed that Luo Fan had the upper hand from the start, in reality, the Nine Tribulations expert naturally would not really suffer much. Even if he was humiliated, he had gained a lot from this. After all, he had indeed stayed in the Tao Fruit Division for a period of time. During this period of time, although he was unable to deeply analyze the Tao Fruit Division, it was impossible to say that he could completely analyze all the mysteries of the Tao Fruit Division. However, with his realm, his observation ability, his perception ability, his unimaginable perspective, and his unfathomable accumulation of knowledge, it was enough for him to see the essence of the Tao Fruit Division through many appearances. Through this essence, it was enough for him to have a deeper understanding of the Tao Fruit. It would be of great help to him in improving his realm and in forming the Tao Fruit in the future. From this point of view, his gains could be said to be quite huge. However, although the gains were not small, from the initial unfathomable to the current situation where Luo Fan had almost uncovered all of his secrets, the feeling was obviously not good for him. At least, the impact on his self-esteem was not small, and he felt an inexplicable sense of defeat. Of course, although this was in his heart, there was no change in his expression, and he still maintained his original indifference. As a Nine Tribulations expert in the 6th level of the road to Tao Master, in front of a peak 7 Tribulations expert, he obviously could not lose his demeanor.